The story begins by introducing us to the beautiful protagonist, Shanna Castilla. She is described by an unknown man who admires the beauty of her hair, which looks like snow-white lily petals stained with demon blood. The man, with his hand to his chest and desperately marvelling at her appearance, suggests that the protagonist is actually a witch. However, even such circumstances did not prevent him from continuing his monologue about his sensual heart belonging to her. The man extends his hand with an expensive ring on his finger to the chained girl and, without hiding his smirk, urges the witch to kiss her. The man was about to offer to even convince his parents to let Shanna stay the night in his chambers, as he immediately receives a strong kick under the chin and falls to the ground. Guards ran to the rumble, calling out to the young lord who was already lying under the pressure of the witch's naked leg. Shanna threatened that one more move by the guards would have fatal consequences for their master. The girl's piercing gaze made the guards shudder. We later learn that the 22-year-old girl's name is Li Sha Ni, and she was imprisoned 3 days earlier in a world unknown to her. And all those 3 days in confinement, she was starved, so she was ready to attack anyone. Her strong, sinister aura made the guards tremble and obey her orders on pain of their master's death. The girl ordered the guards to prepare a table full of food and a horse for her, and while the guards hurried to the exit of the dungeon, she had time to escape. Shanna demanded to be given the key to the chains. The young lord tossed it with a trembling hand right into the witch's restrained hands. She had no trouble catching it and freeing herself. As the girl undid the chains, she wondered how she'd gotten here. All she remembered was the dark street where she'd come home from work. An unknown voice called out to her, and now she found herself in this reality that the girl had taken as a dream. Shanna tried to get out of her dire situation by resisting the guards, but it made no difference. In an hour, she would be sentenced to death, which meant being burned alive. The girl decided that it was necessary to escape immediately. As luck would have it, the guards had managed to lock her cell, and the gentleman, who had been unconscious for a long time, didn't have the key. In a panic, Shanna paced the cold floor until she found a bronze window leading directly outside. The bars were old and malleable, so she should have no trouble breaking them. The girl decided to use a proven method of escape that she had once seen in a manhwa, using an iron rod and cloth to break the bars. She had just the necessary items at hand, a torn cloth from her dress and a rod forgotten by the guards. The lattice gave way easily, and Shanna looked out hopefully. But her expectations were not at all realized. Her dungeon was at the top of a huge castle, so a fall could be fatal. But it was dangerous to stay in the dungeon, because it was a matter of life and death. After a moment's thought, Shanna jumped confidently from the window, hoping that the dense trees below would cushion her fall. The girl swiftly flew downward, expecting to land on the branches of the trees. She was surprised when her naked foot landed directly on the face of the unknown gentleman. The guards accompanying the man attacked by Shanna's foot froze at the girl's sudden appearance. It turned out she had landed on the prince himself. We wonder how likely it was that the second most important man in the country would be under her window. Now the girl had no choice but to run as fast as she could. The guards scrambled to catch up with the witch, but it was the same prince who caught up with her, who had taken her by the waist and put her on his horse. With a smile on his face, the guy asked her what crime she had committed. It was the end. Shanna was taken back to the execution and tied to a pole. The crowd shouted curses and angry calls for the witch to be burned, ignoring the fact that if Shanna really was a witch, she wouldn't just be standing there. The girl tried to reason with the crowd, but her words were heard by the prince himself. He mentioned that a few years ago the royal family had already announced the destruction of the witch. The statement was addressed to the very gentleman whom Shanna had attacked in the dungeon, Sir Ballard. He confirmed the prince's words, but added that he had seen everything with his own eyes. 3 days ago, he'd seen this girl absorbing moonlight in the ruins of the moon altar. Shanna had screamed that she had done no such thing. Ballard cited witnesses who recounted how the girl spoke to the blue moon, which glowed red at the end of the spell. The girl watched nervously as all these people blatantly lied to the prince. Until 3 days ago, she was in her own world and called Li Sha Na, not Shanna Castilla. But the prince coldly ordered Shanna to be burned. He believed that if she was really a witch, the fire would not harm her, and if she died, she would be punished for the attempted murder of a member of the royal family. With these words, he began to walk away from the execution square. Shanna, overwhelmed with anger, shouted a curse after him, wishing the prince would be struck by lightning. Suddenly, a bright, dangerous flash flashed in front of the boy. Lightning struck from the clear sky right in front of him, followed by a heavy downpour. The people marveled at this rarity, looking at the cloudy sky, for rain was rare in their region. There was a silence in which everyone was thinking about their own things. Suddenly the prince laughed, asking Shanna if it was her doing. The girl looked at the boy in silence, not knowing what to say. The witch was chained up and taken on horseback to the middle of nowhere. Shanna didn't know whether to tell the prince it was an accident. There was a good chance he would kill her, but it was still a good chance to escape. His servants came to the prince, offering to escort the prisoner, but he said he would take care of her personally and take her back to the palace with him. Shanna was about to try to admit that she wasn't who she said she was, as she slipped on the eroded ground and fell. Soon the sun came out and illuminated the clear water of the stream in which the girl was washing her dress. She had just escaped from the prison and had fallen into the hands of the prince himself. Shanna leaned into the cool stream, looking at her reflection. She thought that such a beautiful and expensively dressed girl should be of royal or ducal lineage, or even the daughter of a baron, but not a criminal. Suddenly her musings were interrupted by flushed guards, who brought her a voluminous shirt and boots from the prince himself, who had kindly provided them as a substitute for her soaked dress. It was all they could provide. Tightening her shirt at the waist, Shanna decided she could manage without pants, since the main goal right now was survival. She let out a sigh of dismay and threw her dress into the river. The puzzled guards thought she had been swept away by the current and went in search of her. Shanna herself had escaped into the thicket, hiding behind the dense thickets. She had no magic at all, but she was physically fit. She easily climbed up the tree, where she watched the guard looking around for the girl. Aiming at the back of the guard's head, Shanna deftly jumped down and struck him with her heel, knocking him to the ground and taking away his sword. She began to tauntingly urge the defeated guard to fight her if she took a chance. But it was the one who was out of her league to take the risk. A blade belonging to the prince himself appeared at the girl's neck, glaring angrily at the witch. There was a clang that accompanied the girl's attempt to wrestle the blade away. But the recoil of the blow seemed to damage Shanna's wrist, causing the sword to fall out of her hands. The girl was already clasping her eyes, waiting for her demise, when suddenly the prince lifted her in his arms and carried her back to the horses. The bewildered girl only had time to open her mouth before all her questions were cut off by the prince, with the sly assertion that if she didn't like something, she'd go longer on foot. Shanna puffed up her cheeks, but decided it would at least be a chance to see the royal palace before her execution. The prince ordered the girl to hold on to him tighter, grabbing the reins. Shanna didn't understand why she would obey, until an arrow flew past the horse named Iverson, who stood up on his hind legs. The sudden movement made the girl wrap her arms around the prince and squeeze her eyes shut. The prince ordered his subjects to hide, announcing an ambush, and Shanna hugged him and hid, anticipating that she wouldn't make it to the prison at this rate. The carnage began. Smoke bombs were thrown onto the road in front of the horses, making it impossible for Shanna to open her eyes. The prince raised his sword, which glowed with a light blue light, and swung it in the air. They found themselves in the middle of a quiet clearing. They seemed to have escaped from the pursuit. Immediately from the summit came a rumbling sound, accompanied by a pile of stones tumbling down on the couple. The servants only had time to call out to their master, Prince Luther. The prince, like the witch, was fine. They stared at each other for a few seconds in an awkward pose, surrounded by the stones that had so successfully created a circle that shielded them from outside threats. Iverson's horse was also left behind the stone barrier, which was a problem. Now they were left without a means of transportation. While Luther pondered what they should do, the girl looked at the stones in amazement. It was amazing that he had managed to create this with a single swing of his sword. We realize that this world is indeed full of magic. The prince decided to visit the Count of Castile, and from there return to the palace. It must be the home of the witch's family. Luther took Shanna's hand and set off. The girl was indignant at this behaviour, but it was the only way to keep her, for the young man had no rope at hand. He could not trust her. Shanna thought about confessing everything, but even in such a magical world, she was unlikely to believe that she was from another land. The witch could only theorize that she might just be a countess who had lost her memory. Luther explained that it would take them half a day to get to the Count's house on foot. At least they could have dinner there. Shanna listened, paying attention to the prince's trembling hand still holding hers. Suddenly, Luther leaned his hand against a tree, breathing heavily. It appeared that the arrow that had grazed him had been dispatched. The prince fell unconscious from the poison of the arrow. At the same time, cries of despair were heard in the house of Sir Ballard, the instigator of the ambush. Ballard waved his arms and wailed that the prince must not live. If Luther found out that he had done it, he would be finished, for he, though second prince, belonged to the royal family. Ballard swore to his father that he would destroy the prince who had miraculously escaped and taken his beloved Shanna with him. In anger, Sir threw the letter and the inkwell off the table, sprinkling black liquid all around. Ballard shook with anger, reasoning that it was dangerous for a surviving witch in the woods, even with a prince whom Sir thought ugly. It turned out that Ballard himself had arranged the whole execution. The girl had been imprisoned for 3 days, eating porridge and water. She was to be burned, and then she would have realized the true intentions of the Sir and accepted his proposal. With a hysterical scream, he demanded that his unlovely Shanna be brought to him immediately. It was getting evening. The girl was still in the forest with the prince under a tree. She sucked the poison from Luther's wound and treated the wound. It was enough for the time being. Shanna took the advice of her grandfather, who had taught her the properties of healing herbs. Even though he had explained it to her about 10 years ago, she still remembered his stories well. The girl was worried that she had been giving her grandfather a lot of trouble lately. But there was no time for sentimentality. Li Sha-na cheered herself up with a clap on her cheek, driving away the negative thoughts. Then she noticed a sword with a golden hilt attached to the young man's belt. She quickly found a use for it. Of course it was fishing. The river nearby was quite lively, so she managed to catch as many as 3 fish by hand. In the end, Shanna gathered a whole forest table of apples, roots, and fish. Crunching the juicy fruit, she waited for the prince to wake up. His fever had broken, but he still needed rest. They would have to spend the night right in the middle of the forest. The rapidly darkening sky was replaced by a night of stars. Here and there a hungry wolf howl could be heard. Shanna was diligently rubbing the stick against the wood, trying to get fire to escape the attack of the forest animals. The fire kept failing to appear, and the wolves were getting closer. Clamping her eyes shut, Shanna begged for at least a spark to show under the dry leaves. But suddenly, a bright flame erupted beneath her hands, illuminating everything around her. The flames that erupted from the small spark surrounded the girl, creating an impregnable wall of fire protecting her. The girl was grateful to all the gods for allowing her to get fire. However, it seemed that everything around her was about to burn to the ground. She consoled herself that it was better than being eaten alive. The fire was growing smaller, and beyond this barrier could be heard the growling and howling of the wolves, who were driving away from their mistress witch the men who had come from the Ballard estate. The voices of the servants were heard, saying that Shanna, who was born into a noble family, must be brought alive because their master's life was connected to her, so they had to get to her first. Shanna wrinkled her face in disgust, and then set the wolf with the peculiarly different blue-gold eyes on her abusers. The night passed quietly. The wolf frightened Ballard's servants away, and then disappeared just as quietly. The places where the flames had burned a few minutes earlier were untouched, as if by magic. Now the girl knew for certain that she was none other than a witch. A tired Shanna, who had spent all night tending to the prince, fell down beside him, resting her head on Luther's shoulder. The prince woke at the touch and stared at Shanna for a few moments. Then he rose and, holding the girl's head with his hand, lifted her into his arms and strode on. Now she was not just a criminal, but his saviour. Shanna Li Sha-ne had a dream. She saw her own family from the Earthworld, her mom, dad, grandpa, little brother, and even her cat Bread. Her family was heading somewhere, leaving her alone in the void. Shanna called out to them until she woke up in the soft, spacious bed, breathing heavily. As the girl came to her senses, she looked around. Shanna woke up in luxurious chambers in a house unknown to her, decorated with stucco and patterns. Shanna remembered well that she had fallen asleep in the middle of the forest next to the prince. Now she was in an expensive mansion with a fragrant rose garden outside the window. As soon as I opened my eyes, my attention was immediately drawn to the huge golden chandelier, which was worth a fortune. Such luxury is worthy only of a palace. The girl thought she had been brought here while she slept. Shanna tried to get out of bed to find someone, but her legs felt like cotton and didn't obey at all. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, drowning in a dreamy memory of her family. She shook her head and tried to regain consciousness. It was just in time, for a short girl came into the room, dropping a bucket of utensils at Shanna's sight. Covering her mouth with her palms, the girl looked at the witch with tears in her eyes, not believing her eyes. Immediately she swooped down upon her dear mistress with a tight embrace, shedding tears of joy at her awakening. Without wasting a moment, the girl immediately said she would bring Shanna some hot porridge and ran out of the room. The mistress was stunned, looking at her and not understanding who had just been so happy to see her return. Over a delicious breakfast, Shanna tried to ask the girl about her past, citing amnesia. It turned out that the girl's name was Marion, or simply Marie. She introduced herself as Shanna's personal maid, and though she didn't look it, she was very strong. The witch was on the estate of Count Castilla, and Shanna was the only child in the family, and also the heiress. 4 days ago, the mistress left her chambers for a night walk, and then disappeared. It was more convenient in such a situation to pretend that she didn't know anything, and then that she remembered everything abruptly. Shanna didn't know where to start: imprisonment, dungeon, or escape. So she hastily admitted that she'd lost her memory while sipping hot tea and eating a hearty breakfast. Marie couldn't believe that Shanna really didn't remember anything, especially the eager embrace of the prince who had brought her to the manor. The witch choked on her tea at this unexpected news. His Highness himself had brought her here. Marie, blushing slightly, recounted how she watched with excitement behind them. The prince carried Shanna all the way to the bed and left her to rest. The girl couldn't listen to this further out of shame, but she couldn't help but indulge her curiosity about what happened next. Marie added that His Highness, upon hearing Shanna's name, had given it some thought and said he would send someone for her before he left. It turns out that the prince, having learned that the girl is a witch but belongs to a noble family, decided to spare her. What hypocrisy! The girl puffed up her cheeks in resentment, realizing this. On the bright side, however, it was a favorable outcome, because she managed to escape from that horny guy's prison. Shanna said she was tired, so she asked Marie to leave her alone in the chambers. The maid obediently got up, and as she left the door, reminded her that her mistress could always turn to her if she needed anything. As soon as the door slammed shut, Shanna breathed a sigh of relief and fell back onto the spacious bed. She'd gone from suicide bomber to countess in one night, which was an incredible stroke of luck. Lying in the warm bed, the girl decided with a good feeling that she would stay at the manor for a while and think hard about how she would get back home. As she rejoiced in her good fortune, the faint chatter of servants sounded beneath the windows of her chambers. There was sadness and longing in the Earl's manor today. The witch looked out the window, through which the sunlight poured in, illuminating the spacious chambers. The place was like a paradise away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Shanna decided that as long as she lived here, she should learn everything about the world as soon as possible. Information about family relationships, hobbies, etiquette and other things would be useful for everyday life. It wouldn't be that difficult, because Li Shanna remembered a lot of things from novels that wouldn't apply in real life. Puzzled, the girl decided to go explore the mansion and opened the door of her chambers. A boy with a large flower pot in his hands suddenly found her outside the door. He was embarrassed by the sight of mistress and turned away, pretending he hadn't seen anything. Shanna was in her pajamas, so it was a natural reaction. From the other end of the hallway came a scream from Marie, furiously reprimanding a guy, who we learn was named Sean. The guy fell to his knees in apology. Immediately changing her tone to a more respectful and gentle one, Marie led Shanna back to her chambers. The witch was struck by such strictness, which one would never notice at first glance, just like her own mother's. While she waited for her servants at the window, the mistress was piecing together what had just happened. The slightest mistake could lead to the punishment of the innocent, so until she learned the whole hierarchy, Shanna decided to be careful. There was a knock on the door. It was Marie, who had brought Shanna's everyday clothes. But when she was dressed in that gorgeous red dress, the witch couldn't believe that it wasn't for the holidays. Her waist was so tightly corseted that she could hardly breathe. She also noticed that the maid who was dressing her was gently adjusting her dress and was visibly trembling for no reason. The witch girl shifted her gaze to Mari and noticed the garish green dress in her hands. Li Shana liked green, but as it turned out, the girl whose body she was in didn't like it. The maid walked with Shana out into the hallway. On the way, Marie explained that the garment was the latest fashion dictated by the House of Ballard. However, the abundance of stones and details revealed only the family's lack of taste. In the corridors, Shana kept noticing the servants, whose every move was honed to perfection. If she hadn't known they were real people, she would have thought they were puppets. Marie was showing Shana around the mansion, the study, the tea room, and the various decorations. At one point, they came to a large portrait of Shana hanging on the wall between massive scarlet curtains. The portrait was painted last year in honor of Shana's 18th birthday. Li Shana realized that the witch was 3 years younger than her. The girl in the painting was as cold as ice, perfect and graceful, so it was impossible to take one's eyes off her. Marie looked sadly at her mistress, who even looked at her portrait as if she were seeing both it and the girl in it for the first time. It really does look like complete amnesia. Marie decided that now it was her duty to tell her mistress everything she knew about her. She told her that the witch had been adopted after the fire on her estate. Because of the disaster, the Count took her in and raised her as his own daughter. The maid led Shana over to another portrait that showed a severely dressed man with scarlet hair. It was Count Guard Castilla himself, Shana's adoptive father and her uncle, as well as the owner of the estate where they now lived. The man in the portrait was insanely handsome and cold at the same time. Marie said that his reticence gave the wrong impression of him. In fact, the Count is unable to express his emotions, and he loves Shana more than anything else in the world. Perhaps it was hard for him to express his feelings in words, but his actions spoke for themselves. For example, Guard filled the garden with red roses, Shana's favourite. And when Miss Shana became interested in the oriental tea in the book, he made every effort to seek out the very drink that was only served at the palace. It was like Li Shani's grandfather, for he was the best at making tea for her. The Count was just as caring and attentive. Marie explained that Guard had left the manor when he went to the southern border to fight the enemy on the Emperor's orders. He was about to return, as news of the end of the war had come last week. The Count would probably be angry, because his only vent had lost his memory, and now he couldn't even remember how to properly handle the instruments. Shana put her hand on Marie's shoulder and asked her to tell her everything, believing that everything now depended solely on the maid's knowledge. Marie happily agreed to narrate Mistress's every day and everything she loves. The first hobby was reading, which on the contrary bored Li Shanu to a headache. The text was like a band of bent earthworms, completely impossible to understand. The second was gems. Her favourite pastime was collecting them, and though she had a rather weak body, unable to stay away from the estate for long, she liked to go out for evening walks with her jewels, saying that they looked even more beautiful in the moonlight. The moonlight reminded Li Shane of the circumstances under which she had not nearly been executed. At first she'd assumed Ballard was lying, but now it seemed to her that he could actually see something. Asking about whether Marie knew about her abilities was dangerous. It was worth learning more about the world first. Then Shana suggested that they go home, since it was getting colder outside. On the way to the mansion, Shana stopped, looking at the rose bush. She noticed the single white flower there, standing out so beautifully against the red cloth. Marie nervously brought her hand to her mouth and bit her finger, realizing that the misguided Sean had once again made a mistake. She bowed to her mistress, promising to correct the misunderstanding, even though Li Shana was not angry. In return for this oversight, Marie promised a perfect, delicious dinner for Shana, who was already waiting for her in the mansion's dining room. The food was really excellent. The sumptuous table filled with expensive appetizers, and the main course, a large turkey in the middle of the table, emptied as soon as hungry Shana began to devour it. After a hearty supper, Li Shana, wiping her mouth with a napkin, informed Marie that she would take her usual walk in the garden, to which the maid, bowing obediently, replied that she would also be at her mistress's disposal. As darkness fell under the cold moonlight, Marie stepped out into the garden of fragrant roses, whip in hand, plotting something untoward for her mistress. In the darkness, Shanna, following the custom of the girl in whose body she had to live, went out into the garden, taking the gems with her. She gazed at them through the moonlight and tried to figure out what the witch's powers were. She was trying to guess the spells she could use when suddenly she heard moans and screams of pain from the backyard, startling her. It was Sean, standing with his hands bound and his shirt torn. His body was covered with abrasions from the whip. Shivering and gasping in pain, he was covering several of the servants lying on the ground, exhausted. Marie stood in front of them, holding the same whip she used to torture her subordinates. She told Sean to get out of the way and stop playing the hero. She scolded the servants for their negligence. The dinner that had been served to her mistress today was inedible, though she did not show it, and her portrait was dusty and waiting to be wiped down more than it should have been. So the already exhausted servants were to be severely punished. Marie swung her whip, threatening to make them lose their ability to move for annoying her mistress from morning till night. But her blow was stopped by Shanna coming to her aid, grabbing the whip with her bare hand, causing her arm to bleed. She shouted Marianne's name, making her shudder. The witch ordered her to take the servants to the house for treatment, and afterward to come into her chambers for a serious talk. With these words, she returned majestically to her abode. Outside the door of Li Shana's chambers, she panicked, not understanding how such pathetic excuses were a reason to hit these poor people. The real Shanna was definitely a maniac, not a beautiful lady. There was a knock at the door. It was Marie, who said that all the servants' wounds had been treated, and they were resting in their beds. In her hands was a bag with unknown contents. It turned out to be a present Miss had given Marie for her birthday. The maid averted her eyes and asked for permission to use these things, dumping them on the floor. What was in this bag caused Li Shangya to have even more questions than before. A whip, a gag, and other things that were clearly not used for everyday life. Grinning nervously, Shanna put her bandaged hand to her cheek. She immediately decided that she would burn it and asked Marie not to do it again, since she didn't have such a strange hobby now. Marie shrieked that this was impossible, and such a thing a maid must do for the sake of her mistress, for as it turned out, Shanna was not just gifted, but a witch of misery. At this time we see Prince Luther, out of breath from the long slaughter, resting on his throne surrounded by wounded soldiers. He says that he must get the witch at all costs. This beating was only the beginning. After Luther was recognized as a prince, he led a 3-year military campaign south by order of the emperor. It's one thing to have the enemy in your sights, but it's another to have him sneaking around. The assassins who were lying breathlessly on the floor of the hall had been sent to the prince by someone. Luther, hearing of his father's death, immediately rushed back, but the latter, unwilling to recognize the prince, made him a watchdog. And the duke was definitely involved. To keep his place, the prince will not have enough of Asda's sacred sword alone. For such purposes, he needs a witch. They are neither gods nor men, beings who have been given powers beyond nature and human understanding. They are not subservient to the heavens or the emperor, and adhere to their own beliefs and rules. We see Marie kneeling before Shanna again at this time. She tells her that the witch is able to absorb other people's suffering and use it for her magic. Li Shana exclaimed that since it was so necessary, she was giving up this magic, but the problem was much more serious. It turns out that Shanna was sick, causing her to have to do this for the sake of healing. If the mistress stops absorbing energy, she will experience malaise, fever and cough for 3 days, and may fall into a coma at the end. Li Shana rubbed her forehead with her fingers and couldn't believe that this was possible. But she couldn't accept it either. Then, Shanna took off her shoes and ordered Marie to watch her. She appeared to be perfectly healthy, which amazed her maid, as she deftly performed her fighting tricks and techniques. Li Shana, like the one in whose body she was imprisoned, had been weak since childhood, so she began to strengthen her body by practicing self-defense and honed her skills to an excellent level. With a nervous smile on her face, Shanna stated that she had never been sick once since she had arrived at the manor. It didn't matter what had happened in the past, because what mattered now was that there was no longer any need to resort to such cruel treatments. It had only been a week that Mistress had asked her maid not to use cruel punishments on others, to see how it would go. And so the week passed. Shanna, in her new soft blue robe, strolled under the umbrella Marie had carefully held over her in the garden. She was genuinely interested in the condition of Sean, who was in fact just sneezing. During that week, he had perfectly renovated the garden, which was now filled with different flowers. He also planned to complete the fountain in the centre soon, to make this paradise even more beautiful. Shanna had truly changed in the eyes of the servants. Punishment and torture were eliminated, and small mistakes were forgiven. Her hobbies changed, and her illness miraculously disappeared. And even if the mistress was possessed by a ghost, the servants sincerely wished that it would last forever. After the walk, Shanna rested on the fishnet couch, reading the Manhwa. Marie reported that according to their agreement, she had burned all the instruments of torture because Madame really didn't get sick. However, there was something that the mistress should have known, namely, that there was an unfortunate butler who had been imprisoned in the dungeon for 3 years. Li Shana rushed to rescue the poor man with all her might. She sat down on the banister, rolling freely on it down the stairs. At the same time, the door opened, revealing a familiar man. The girl, having reached the end of the stairs, fell right into the arms of the Earl himself, who had finally returned to the manor. The Count was madly handsome and calm, as if he had stepped out of a painting. He set the girl on her feet, wondering if she was hurt. Li Shana didn't know how she should address him at all, as father or uncle, or perhaps use both. However, the answer was urgent. With a smile on her face, the girl replied that she was fine, calling the Count affectionately Papa, which made the man's eyes widen in shock. It seemed the girl had made a mistake in her choice of address. The Count hugged Shanna tightly, saying from the bottom of his heart what he probably wanted to say before, that his only heart, his daughter, had finally accepted him. They went to the living room to drink tea with various goodies. There was an awkward silence. Li Shana remembered Marie apologizing to her for not telling her earlier that Shanna had never called godfather before. The Count was known as a favorite of the royal family, so he was often sent to war. For this reason, for months, or even years, the mansion was empty without him. He always pampered his mistress with expensive gifts, but she always said she did not love him. They were father and daughter who could not find a common language. It was obvious, for after the Count's heartfelt confession to her on the doorstep, he had been drinking tea and thinking about something for half an hour. Shanna tried to apologize, but the Earl said she could call him whatever she wanted. She called him father again, which also brought a smile to the face of the cold master of the manor. The girl tried to start a conversation by asking why the Earl had returned earlier than he had said in his letter. He replied that he had returned immediately after His Majesty's funeral. And now, Prince Luther's coronation is expected, and a banquet to celebrate the festivities. Li Shana immediately remembered the handsome guy who tried to execute her. She resolutely refused to go, but this was not an event she could so easily skip, even on pain of death. After a brief pause, Guard asked where Raphael was. She had no idea who the Count was talking about, until it dawned on her that he was the butler who had been locked in the dungeon for 3 years during Guard's absence from the manor. She was just about to release him, but who knew the master of the manor would return so soon? She didn't even know what had happened, so she didn't know what to say. Shanna called out with concern in her voice to Marie, who was unfortunately absent, also saying that the butler was not feeling well today. The Count did not listen and ordered the servants to bring the butler with a wave of his hand. An elegantly dressed man in white with an eye patch and silver hair entered the room, apologizing for being late. He clearly didn't look like an ordinary butler. The butler confirmed that he wasn't feeling well, so Miss let him go to rest. He defended her for a reason unknown to Li Shana. The Count ordered Raphael to take charge of Shanna's preparations for the coronation. The deadline was rather tight because of the unexpected circumstances, so it was necessary to hurry up. The butler agreed without hesitation, glancing at Shanna with indifference and inviting her to follow him. Shanna wanted to object, but suddenly she was stopped by Raphael's voice, as if it sounded in her head. The voice warned her that he would tell the Count the truth if she disobeyed. She glanced at the butler, who was standing by the fireplace as if nothing had happened. Perhaps she had imagined it, or perhaps it was a telepathic connection. While Shanna was trying to figure out if she was dreaming or not, Guard was talking about how the prince should have 6 months to prepare after the emperor's funeral. But this ceremony was an exception, so it was reduced to 3 months. Raphael called the maid Rona, asking her not to help Marie, who had gone to a well-known clothing store in the capital to buy catalogues to find out what evening dresses the invited ladies would wear. The maid bowed obediently and left. Raphael continued to talk about what was to be done before the feast. Shanna had to follow a strict diet and bathe in sheep's milk for 2 months to keep her skin white. Expensive wine and roses were necessary for a pleasant body fragrance, and for skin tone before going to bed for a full body massage for a complete picture. The hair, on the other hand, required care with oriental essential oils. Li Shana was horrified at the amount of what she thought was pointless behavior that she demanded that this reasoning stop. Shanna took it as an insult, as if she was so foul-smelling that she needed to undergo so many procedures every day. She walked up to Raphael, clomping her heels loudly, and jabbed her finger at his chest, ordering him to give her the catalogue. In her opinion, all she needed was a nice outfit. But that was out of the question. Raphael stood his ground, but Shanna took advantage of her position. Her mistress's orders were not to be disobeyed. He was likely to help her this time. A sly smile stretched across the witch's face. The girl led the frowning butler out of the hall by the hand. She thanked him for not giving her away. She promised that such confinement would not happen again. Though it wasn't her fault, the girl had to pay the debts of the body she now lived in. She was ready to do whatever she could, and whatever the servant wanted, for he had suffered a long time locked up. This enraged Raphael, and he grabbed the girl by the arm and threw her back against the wall, exclaiming that she was not his mistress. Pressing Shanna against the wall, he shouted that she had no right to impersonate his mistress. Raphael knew that Li Shana was someone who came from another world. The witch collapsed to the floor in puzzlement. The blindfold resting on the butler's eye came off, revealing a colour defect. The same wolf with blue-gold eyes that had protected her from the raid in the forest appeared before her. It turned out that 3 years ago, Raphael had begged his mistress on his knees not to do anything irreparable. Even though she could control the divine power, it was impossible to break the dimensional wall. His mistress, Shanna Castilla, didn't want to hear it, for the wretched wizard had no right to order the great witch around. Raphael was just a dog to her, waiting for his master's command. The witch was about to leave the world that bored her soon. Giggling, she tried to guess if her servant would recognize her in another incarnation. Raphael couldn't imagine why his mistress had decided to swap bodies with a man from another world. With tears in his eyes, he declared that he would never recognize her. Li Shana was fed up with the lectures from all sides. She grabbed the butler by the collar, stopping his tearful arguments. She told him that since she had come to this world because of his mistress, he should put things back to normal. The girl stared angrily at Raphael, expecting some kind of response. Surprisingly, the boy only shyly turned away, telling her not to look at him like that. Only he knew what that strange reaction was. Then Li Shana grabbed the butler's tie clip and put it on her cheek. She made a condition. If he did not tell her everything he knew, she would disfigure the face of his favourite mistress. It must have been blackmail, but she knew exactly what she was doing. She revealed her hand with the remaining redness on her palm, and told how she had recently grabbed a whip with her bare hands. Therefore she would be able to withstand such an injury. Pretending to be the Count's daughter wasn't that hard, but the thought of her family, who was surely waiting for her return, did not let her go. But then it hit the girl. If she was here now, the real Shanna must have taken up her body in another world. At this moment, the butler grabbed Li Shanu's hand with a sharp clamp, pulling it away from her face with all his might and leaning closer and closer to her. Marie ran into the corridor with concerned shouts, holding fresh catalogues in her hands. Something was going on outside, and she had intended to tell her mistress, but she caught the obscene scene in the midst of it. In a panic, the maid picked up a flower pot and smashed it over Raphael's head. The butler collapsed on top of Shanna, instantly unconscious. Marie wondered what was going on, since Raphael had been locked up all this time for a reason. It turned out that he had to be locked up because of his excessive admiration for his mistress. But in the end he couldn't stand the distance. The maid didn't understand why such a creature had been chosen by Shanna to be her butler. Indeed, Raphael was a witch's familiar. They were creatures, usually demons, elves, or animals, raised by a witch and devoted to her unconditionally. Marie was afraid that the Count would find out, but Raphael assured her that everything was under control and gave her an assignment. As the girl had noticed, the familiars did have an unusual relationship with their mistress. Then, when Raphael woke up, she would find out everything in detail. In the meantime, they took him to his mistress's chambers, wondering what to do with him next. The Earl's call, searching for Shanna all over the estate, came from the hallway. In her haste, Marie told the girl to leave the rest to her and put on her best dress. In a beautiful light purple gown with fabulous fishnet work, the lady descended to the Earl. Before her stood a formation of royal subjects. Count Guard explained that these men had been sent for her personally, to which the girl was very surprised. One of those who came announced that the Castilla family had been asked to pay tribute to the son of the empire. The count and his daughter knelt, obediently saluting. Then a message was read out, in which the sole son of the empire, Luther Ramad Titan, officially invited Shanna Castilla to the coronation ceremony. The girl, nervous, raised her head. It was also announced that the prince was asking the miss to choose the first musical composition of the ball, and was also looking forward to her answer. It was a thank you for spending the night together with a lady of indescribable beauty. There was an awkward silence among the servants, Shanna and Guard, caused by the ambiguous message. His Royal Majesty the Prince of the Titan Empire, Luther has had innate abilities, leadership skills, and incredibly good looks since childhood. His only flaw, perhaps, was that in his mind women had no more meaning than fallen leaves on the side of the road. The Count was petrified, unable to understand how so much could have changed in one night. Shanna blurted out that it was not what anyone would think when they heard it. Li Shana hastily made up an unbelievable story about how she had helped him find an important item for His Majesty. According to her, she had been out late last week, walking in the village. What she found for him was an important item left by her mother. She'd turned him down many times, but finally she couldn't stand it. And now the prince intends to thank her. Guard was satisfied with this story. He sent his daughter to rest, and she in turn wished that the count would do the same, for he must be very tired. Satisfied, the girl went to her chambers. The count stood in the same place, thinking about what had happened. After the war in the south, the prince returned to the capital to avoid being killed and met his Shanna on the way. Come to think of it, he had always been indifferent to the opposite sex, and it was not customary in society to give so many gifts for just one found item. However, in the count's eyes, Shanna was the most beautiful person in the world, so he was not surprised by this choice. He grinned smugly and decided that the difficult adolescence was probably over, because even Shanna was more courteous than before. A month rose in the sky, illuminating the white, immense mansion. It was time to catch the wolf cub that had been resting in Mistress's bed. Raphael awoke with his shirt unbuttoned. When he opened his eyes, he tried to figure out what scent he was smelling now. It certainly wasn't his mistress. The scent was fresher and sweeter. He found that his arms and legs were tied with ribbons to the edges of the bed, restricting his movements. He was finally awakened by Shanna calling out to him, causing him to panic. The two of them were alone in the room, and outside the door was guarded by trustworthy men. The girl raised a large quill in front of her face, glaring menacingly at her servant. She demanded that he tell her everything Raphael knew. Otherwise, she would show him, like his mistress, who the wicked witch was. The butler shouted that the girl was a real psychopath, as suddenly she started tickling his naked torso mercilessly with a feather. The butler shouted that the girl was a real psychopath, when suddenly she started tickling his naked torso mercilessly with a feather. The girl got off the familiar, and then he told her all the information he had. It turned out that he had no idea how to put everything back to normal. The real Shanna went for a walk as usual, but instead of the usual routine, she exchanged souls with Li Sha-Noi on the moon altar, and the girl was captured by Sir Ballard, who caught the ritual. The dog was hesitant to rescue the stranger who had taken over his mistress's body, but Raphael didn't know she was capable of such a deft escape. With an ironic smile on her face, Shanna put her palm to her cheek, saying that even still, she assumed she was going to die. Lightly waving the soft instrument of torture, she made the butler nervous. Raphael offered to forget about the past, to which the girl agreed. Now that their goals coincide, they can work together. She will return home, and the wolf will find its mistress. Li Shana freed her prisoner from the ribbon shackles. The same agreed to be a temporary familiar for Shanna from the other world. As time passed, Li Shana began to get used to the magical world, but not without Raphael's help. Together with Marie, he corrected her posture, taught her table etiquette and socializing. Euphemisms became part of the girl's life. Figurative and hidden expressions have always been part of the communication of high-ranking people, otherwise one could get into an unpleasant situation. The most important thing left, of course, was magic. There were several types of magic in this world. The first branch was called sacred, godlike power, manifested through the use of a sacred relic, one that had been created by the church over hundreds of years. However, only the royal family could use this power. Such a relic is kept in the hands of Prince Luther. The second branch was called magic, which is used by witches and sorcerers. People believe that it is a power obtained through bargaining with demons, and therefore despise its possessors. It is difficult to describe, because each witch has her own source of obtaining and way of using this magic. Their familiars, like Raphael, rely on their master's strength and use it. The butler talked about the history of the world for a long time, before he noticed Li Shana snoring on the couch. What a lazy girl. Raphael attacked the girl, but she jumped up and gave him her stern look again, calling him a nasty dog. As before, Raphael could not contain his embarrassment, so he turned away from the girl with restraint. His mistress's eyes were beautiful to him, but he could not bear to stare into them for 10 seconds. It was time to get down to business. Marie drew the heavy curtains from the windows, plunging the room into darkness. Raphael continued his story. As it became more difficult to pass on the magic year after year, the great witch Aelin of Castilla created a special kind of magic. She breathed magic into the gem to pass it on to her descendants. Raphael lifted the scarlet, glowing stone from Shanna's collection in his hand. He kissed him so hard that he was out of breath and out of breath. No, it was not an act of fidelity. It was not an act of fidelity. It was the breaking of a seal that concealed a great magical power imprisoned in the jewelry. Raphael held out the stone to the girl, urging her to try, for his strength was not enough to break the seal. A squeamish Li Shana asked to wipe the stone after the dog's dirty lips. The butler obediently cleaned it and handed it to Shanna. The girl needed a strong wish that could break the seal. She wished with all her heart that she wanted to return home to her family and kiss the stone. A bright golden glow enveloped the room, and the girl collapsed unconscious to the floor. The seal was broken. Of course, it didn't help Shanna get back. But through the power of the red stone, she had gained knowledge of the language of this world. Now she could read what appeared to be earthworm script, and she could even write in the magical language. However, her handwriting was not neat, so Raphael forbade her to write letters on behalf of his mistress. In addition, her newfound knowledge helped her to break the seals of many other stones as well. Now Li Shana was able to control fire and wind, and even lightning. As she practiced, the magic gradually wore off. The girl, out of breath, stood on all fours on the green grass. This meant only one thing. Someone would have to get hurt again to restore the mistress's strength. Marie and Shanna's gaze fell on the poor butler, who had once again been subjected to a merciless tickling with a feather. It was the safest way to restore the witch's strength. That was how the training went. And so, the day of the coronation arrived. The castle was surrounded by a festive atmosphere. Fireworks were rattling around, and people were painstakingly gathering for the festivities. The coronation ceremony of His Majesty Prince Luther, the unchangeable ruler of the Titan country, was grand. The sky was clear and blue, as if blessing the air. At night, however, the earth was illuminated by Aya's blue moon, which had appeared previously about 100 years ago. The coronation must be attended by all sorts of distinguished families. The Ballard family was no exception. Back in his estate, the Duke praised his daughter Maylin, comparing her to the goddess of the blue moon. The girl was indeed beautiful, long, thick emerald hair and fuchsia-coloured eyes, and her snow-white skin was framed by matching motley robes. Duke Ballard expected a lot from his blood. She knew it, and promised not to miss the roast duck, like her brother who longed for Shanna. She was probably talking about the prince. He would spend tonight with Maylin, and she was sure of it. Meanwhile, the Earl of Guard and Shanna were already hurrying in the carriage to the feast. It was getting late at night, but they had to arrive before His Majesty arrived at the banquet. Shanna assured her father with a smile on her face that everything would be fine, though she was visibly nervous herself. The count smiled and told the girl not to worry. Their plans were only to greet the prince and return to their estate. It would not be impolite, for Shanna had been sick often as a child, and when she began to appear at balls, she began to recover. Luther was the biggest problem in Li Shangya's life. He wanted to burn Guard's precious daughter and then tied her to a horse, and now the count wants to greet him. This is a real murder. However, the banquet hall was worth seeing. Rich decorations glittered here and there, and the guests were the most important addition to the evening. The Duke of Ballard's daughter shone among the crowd. For the sake of the empire's well-being, Prince Luther was obliged to marry soon, and the role of queen, according to the surrounding girls, was suited to the refined and luxurious Mei Lin. The lady was shyly covering herself with a fan, even though she admitted it. The first dance was surely promised to Mei Lin as Count Guard and Shanna Castilla suddenly arrived in the hall, causing everyone to turn their attention to them. Shanna was gorgeous. Her shiny silver hair, mysterious as drops of blood on the snow, was braided with flowers, and her dress was beyond praise, light and elegant, emphasizing all the delicacy of her image. No one could outshine her that evening. Shanna was confused. All eyes were on her and the Earl, who was carefully leading her by the hand down the aisle. She should have dressed more modestly, like the others, but the servants stood their ground, for His Majesty had sent such a letter for a reason. Luckily, at least the shoes were comfortable with a good heel height. The girl walked under the stares of the others until she noticed the very guy who had imprisoned her in the dungeon and ostentatiously pretended to choke. The girl complained to the Count that there was supposedly a lot of smoke in the hall, and while His Majesty had not yet arrived, she would go rest on the balcony. Shanna hurried out of the hall, leaving her father behind. The balcony was empty, with only the bright moon illuminating everything around her. The cool breeze brought her to her senses. She leaned her hands on the stone railing and thought it best to forget about this man for now. Raphael didn't know what his mistress had in common with this unpleasant young man either, so the best solution was to avoid Sir Ballard. Shanna's blood-silver hair was developing in the fresh breeze, with which came the scent of the palace garden. The place was surprisingly secluded and pleasant to relax and stay. Well, she thought, why shouldn't she stay here? Shanna was not familiar with the other ladies, so she could have pleaded that she did not know His Majesty had arrived at the banquet. But her joys were interrupted by 3 strangers who disturbed her privacy. Among these ladies was Mei Lin, who stated that she hadn't seen Shanna since she was 12 years old. She had changed a lot during that time. Li Shana was trying to remember Ballard's surname when she was suddenly lifted under the arms of the ladies on both sides. They were Hailun from the Ruka family and Siula from the Andre family. The real Shanna Castilla first appeared at a ball when she was 12 years old. She was considered by many to be a pretty girl, but they saw nothing special in her, and God only knows why she alone was able to escape the terrible fire in which she lost her parents. She was never talkative and carried with her a depressed look. At the debut banquet, she was always by her Uncle Guard's side and only bowed her head in greeting to the guests who addressed her. After rumours spread among the nobility about her weakness and tendency to illness, Shanna became a rare guest at ceremonial events. Mei Lin irritably clutched the fan she had so diligently used to hide her face, not accepting that this girl from the Earl family dared to underestimate her, Duke Ballard's daughter. Shanna asked to be released, but suddenly her face and dress were doused with champagne. It was Mei Lin's sneaky prank, which was justified by her hand shivering from the cold. She wryly pointed out that today is clearly a day in which Shanna has no luck. And even if the prince appreciates the Castilla family, that doesn't give Shanna the right to wear such a gorgeous dress. Now there was a reason to change it to a more appropriate one, since it had been ruined by the spilled champagne. Mei Lin's henchwomen began to agree with their leader, saying that Shanna should have borrowed the dress from the maid. Li Shana stood silently. A drink dripped down her face, dripping onto her soiled outfit. This was it. It was all because of the dress. And she thought something terrible had happened. The girl lifted her bangs with the palm of her hand, exposing her grin. With a smile, she remarked that the ladies looked like 3 ducks, causing them to look confused and indignant with such an expression. Suddenly, a strong wind came up, knocking the 3 rascals off their feet. It was the pranks of Li Sha-nui, who decided to give the three ladies a lesson in decorum. But she couldn't reveal all her cards, avoiding problems, so she decided to forgive them generously today. Playing surprised, Shanna was puzzled that such a strong wind had come out of nowhere in such nice weather. The ladies were so frightened that they couldn't utter a word. Their hairstyles were hopelessly messed up and looked like birds' nests, Shanna said with a smile, as she removed a branch from Mei Lin's hair. Li Shanna said, as she left the balcony, that she would call the servants and let them rest for the time being. It was an undeniable victory. It was not for nothing that the girl had beaten everyone in the yard with a stick as a child. She had the strength and determination to win. Suddenly, it was announced that His Majesty King Luther, ruler of the Titan Empire, had arrived. Shanna was startled to see the handsome villain on the high staircase. This was the end of it. She needed to justify the champagne on her dress sooner rather than later and hurry home. But suddenly their glances crossed. The girl did not understand how he could only notice her from afar among such a dense crowd of people. Luther swiftly began to descend the stairs, and Shanna ran to find her handsome Earl father to report everything. But wherever she turned, His Majesty followed her. Finally, she saw guard and called out to him. The Count turned just as Luther caught up with Shanna, grabbing her arm tightly. The king asked where the beautiful woman was in such a hurry and was leaving him. A whisper crept into the crowd at the sight of this picture. The girl tried to break free, twisting her arm, but the grip was too strong. Luther pulled the girl by her waist to him, claiming her ear, annoyingly asking if Shanna thought he'd forgotten her, the witch. Luther whispered to Shanna that if she wanted to live, she had better listen to everything he said. Today, all the high-ranking people were in attendance, so the day was shaping up to be the best day to reveal her secret. The crowd began to whisper as they watched the king approach the girl's face and whisper something to her. This guy was even worse than Li Shanna had imagined. He decided to take full advantage of his position, realizing that Shanna had saved his life when he was wounded by a poisoned arrow. Suddenly, Luther got down on his knee and kissed the witch's hand. He asked the girl's permission to spend the evening with her. The girl was panicking. She prayed that it turned out to be a joke. However, the man was quite serious, ordering her to answer him. There was nothing left but to give her consent. People immediately began to whisper. There were rumours that the former prince had a secret lover, and perhaps the rumours were not unfounded. The Duke of Ballard stood in a mute stupor. The king had chosen Miss Castilla for the first dance, which settled all their family's plans. A defeated Mei Lin snapped her expensive fan in frustration, staring at the couple who had begun to dance. She turned to her father in despair, hoping for his support. The Duke had a backup plan. He whispered something to his servants, and they left the room. The king smelled alcohol on his partner's hands. He joked with a nonchalant face that champagne baths were rather exotic nowadays. Shanna laughed playfully at Luther's joke, deliberately stepping on his foot with her heel. She wanted to find out what he was up to. The plan to pretend they were in love, like in some fringe novel, seemed extremely unreliable. Luther was undeterred. Turning sharply, he ploughed the girl onto his supporting arm, holding her by the leg like tango moves. He needed much more than a fake crush. Suddenly, the king offered Shanna to be his queen. He stopped the dance and announced to the whole hall his decree that he, the only son of the Titan Empire, intended to make Miss Castilla his only moon. The hall stopped, heeding the decree. The count was petrified at this news, and poor Li Shanna panicked again, not accepting such insistence. But the celebration was interrupted by the sudden shattering of the windows, through which the mercenaries flew into the hall. The intruders scattered smoke bombs, causing the crowd to cough from lack of air and become lost in space. The imperial guards that were supposed to protect the king had already been defeated. Count Guard ordered the mobilization of troops outside the city, and he himself tried to call for his precious daughter. His call was stopped by a blow to the head that rendered the count unconscious. There was a clang from the naked blade. A blue light illuminated the hall, dispelling the smoke, and the men in robes appeared around the king, showing him to surrender. They had his Shanna hostage, still resentful of Luther's offer to be his only moon. How cliché. But there were other things to think about now. It was foolish to pretend that another accidental hurricane had blown everything away, or a sudden fire had started. But it was the safest thing to limit it to a good and accurate blow. The mercenary put the knife close to the girl's throat. He knew she was capable of cursing others, so he warned her not to waste her strength. This man was the brother of the man who had been bitten on the soft spot by Shanna's familiar 3 months ago. The man was the brother of the man Shanna's familiar had bitten 3 months ago. The situation had gotten even more complicated. Not only was the witch being held hostage, but now the mercenary was hostile to her. She had to choose the right moment and act carefully, because at any second her life could be over. The mercenary sharply grabbed Shanna's arm, ordering the emperor to drop the sword. Luther flinched and immediately complied. The blade fell to the stone floor with a clang. At that second, a golden chain encircled the emperor's hand. In the past, such a tool was used to capture witches. The chain was quite valuable, as there were only a few of these weapons left in the world. The mercenary exultantly exclaimed that even the witches that brought the empire to ruin couldn't resist the power of this chain, hence the great might here was useless. Off to the side smirked Duke Ballard, who was clearly involved in the attack. In a mocking whisper, he warned the young man to be careful. The mercenaries had gotten what they wanted, but it wasn't enough for them, so they weren't going to stop. The one who had held Shanna hostage said that he had not gotten even with her yet. With a smirk, he looked directly into the emperor's eyes, holding his fiancée close to him and threatening her with a knife. He couldn't just hand her over unharmed. Li Shana was already ready to strike when a whistle suddenly sounded. It was a sword that had suddenly started fighting on its own. It chopped the opponents on the spot, bringing terror to the already terrified crowd. Shanna was frightened and fell right into the emperor's arms. In her fear, she said that he had just killed a man. But this was not the end, for the enemy had not yet fallen. Luther pointed his sword back at the mercenaries. He held the girl close to him and ordered her to stay close, for it was very dangerous. Li Shana was horrified as she recalled the action in the square when she was about to be executed. She realized that such a solution to problems was the norm in this world. After all, she herself had not so long ago wanted to be put to the fire, what to speak of whips and swords. It was necessary not to be afraid, but to survive. However, her saviour began to feel sick. He coughed, falling to his knees. The chains had been broken with difficulty, and now he lacked the strength to stand. He asked Shanna to call him Rune, because she really liked that nickname. After he said that, he collapsed to the floor, bleeding helplessly. The mercenaries grinned, intent on avenging their comrades, and finally sending everyone present to the other side. And now the sharp knives were flying swiftly at the couple. There was no other way out. Shanna concentrated, calling on her powers, and a bolt of lightning struck the palace. People panicked and began to cover themselves with their hoods to escape the omnipresent lightning. The mercenaries shouted that Shanna was a witch, and that this magic was definitely her doing. The girl stopped. The attackers crouched to the ground in fear, dropping their weapons. No one seemed to be hurt, and she had managed to scare them a little. Shanna had no choice but to show what she could do to control the situation. There was an atmosphere of fear and misery in the air that fueled the girl's strength. Although the people were not wounded, but simply frightened, the magic was gradually recovering. But it was not enough, because the girl had exhausted all of her reserve, so it took time to replenish. Well, since the beautiful but harmful king who lay unconscious had helped her, Shanna wanted to return the favour. Putting her arms at her sides, the girl with confidence in her eyes gracefully kicked part of the destroyed chain right into the forehead of one of the villains and declared that she now intended to put the mercenaries behind bars. But the mercenaries had their own plans. They smirked, saying that the witch had driven herself into a dead end, and now she would suffer the same fate as them. With those words, the men in robes slit their throats with knives and fell breathlessly to the floor, bleeding. The nauseating sight horrified the people standing around them. This was not the witch's plan at all. Duke Ballard's voice rang out, outraged at the inaction of the men. He ordered His Majesty to be taken to a safe place for medical attention, the wounded to be taken for treatment, and the aftermath of the rogue's attack to be cleaned up. The servants bustled about, delighted at the arrival of the man in charge. The Count of Guard, who was raving about his precious daughter, was also carried away on a stretcher. Ballard strode majestically through the hall, handing out edicts. His eyes rested on Shanna, still reeling from the utter failure. The order was obvious: burn the witch. The Duke pointed his cane at the frightened girl. Shanna wailed that this was crazy, since she had just saved everyone in the room. But the people, as if they hadn't seen anything before, stared at her in horror. There were whispers in the crowd that the witch had reappeared in the edges of the empire. It seemed to the people that they had long since disappeared, but apparently not all of them. The rumor that she would bring trouble, like the lightning she had summoned, only fueled the general fear of the unknown. The people could not match the fact that the one who had made a contract with evil had saved them, so they supported the Duke's decision. The crowd began to shout angrily about their desire to get rid of the evil power. Shanna was desperate. Anger overwhelmed her. She had spent all her energy trying to save them, and they were crossing all bounds of reason. The girl started shouting and waving her arms, declaring that she wouldn't just give up, and if anyone dared to approach her, she would fry everyone here. But a sudden blow to her head stopped her and made her lose consciousness. It seemed that her plan to save herself was not going to come to fruition. The attacker turned out to be the awakened Luther, into whose hands the girl fell without memory. The servants tried to warn their king of the danger, for the girl was a bloodthirsty sorceress. However, Luther ordered everyone to be silent, or he would personally deal with everyone. The Duke offered to help him deal with the girl, but His Majesty stood his ground. He is determined that Shanna belongs to him. She is his only moon of the Titan Empire, the moon goddess of Aya. Luther took the girl in his arms, looking at her beautiful, sleeping face. The Duke of Ballard would not dare disobey the king's own orders and fall foul of him. He would not have the strength to fight back against God's chosen one. Luther looked sternly at the man, unwilling to yield to anyone. Li Sha-na was unconscious. She had a wonderful dream where she was spending time with her family, her father, mother, grandfather, and brother. Her family, and she looked so happy that she was envious of herself. What a ridiculous sight! She laughed, holding her elbows, but suddenly she saw her hands in front of her. She was like a ghost watching herself from the outside. It turned out she wasn't seeing herself at all, but someone else in her body. The real her smirked, looking in her direction as if she really saw her. Li Sha-na shouted to Shanna to give her back her body, but she was awakened by a voice urging her to get up. It was her faithful dog, Raphael. In her sleepy state, the girl said that she had a nightmare, so she would play with him later. But the real nightmare was the position the girl was now in. Raphael shouted at her, holding on to the golden bars, calling her a stupid woman. Shanna finally came to her senses. She was sitting in a huge golden cage with thick bars, bird-like, and her hands were not wearing the ceiling shackles blocking her magic. She remembered that she was going to teach the reckless people who wanted to execute her again. She tried to get up, but fell to the floor again. She thought she heard the voice of that handsome king before she fell into the realm of Morpheus. Well, it was all clear now. She was trapped in a trap that prevented her from using her powers. It seemed to be over. Raphael crossed his arms, calling Shanna crazy. Her irresponsibility was perfect. Her mistress had kept her abilities a secret all her life, and she had revealed them at the first opportunity to the entire empire. The butler couldn't imagine what she was thinking when she wanted to set off fireworks for everyone. Raphael fiercely reprimanded the girl, who was nervously aware of the gravity of her situation. It wasn't a problem for the henchman to enter her dungeon, because there was an open window in her dungeon. He could use a little effort to remove Li Sha-nui's shackles, but he couldn't handle the golden cage. Then Raphael insisted that the girl should suffer, and then she could escape. As soon as she succeeded, then let her call out to him. The faithful servant wolf would surely come not to save. Looking at each other across the cage, they touched the bars with their hands. The girl gently thanked her temporary familiar and smiled. Raphael was touched by that innocent smile. It was a reaction he'd only had to an angry look before, but now something was different. He waved away the fact that he was only saving his mistress's body. In the guise of a wolf, Raphael left the dungeon through the open window, leaving the girl wondering if Marie and the other servants were all right. But he left so quickly that he didn't hear her. Since the familiar had paid her a visit, it could mean that the manor already knew about everything and was looking for ways around punishment for her in consternation. But most of all, she was concerned about the Count, with whom she had grown so close during this time, even though they were not related. She did not know if he was alive, and remembered only how he had been carried away on a stretcher. At that time, King Luther was approaching the witch's dungeon, accompanied by dutifully bowing servants. He wondered if the girl had awakened when he opened the door to the place of confinement. Shanna pretended to be asleep, hoping she would avoid an unpleasant conversation. The king walked around to the other side of her cage and looked at her intently. She was a terrible actress, which made Luther laugh. The girl replied irritably that it was not her profession, and therefore there was nothing to condemn her for. She sat down, fixing her thick hair carelessly, and wondering what the king would decide to do to her this time, whether he would order her to be burned again or beheaded. His actions and decisions were incomprehensible and chaotic. One minute he was going to kill her because she was a sorceress when he became emperor, and then he decided to make her his wife. Luther coldly stopped her reasoning. He didn't need Shanna's love. All the king wanted was her body. The statement was too shameless and loud, so Shanna showed the king an obscene gesture in exasperation, making it clear that he wasn't getting anything without a fight. But it wasn't quite what she thought it would be. Luther told the story of how the rulers of the Titan Empire carried a 1,000-year curse on their lineage called the Curse of the Seal. It was payback for the imperial family killing the dragon that ruled their current land. The dragon's body disappeared, but the magic it carried within it broke free and turned the earth to ash in a hurricane. The emperor, using the power of the witches, barely managed to seal the dragon hurricane in his soul and pass the seal on to the descendant with the purest soul. That man turned out to be Prince Luther. The king remembered this troubled time, clamouring. It was a story known only to the imperial family. His anguish at the sad tale was interrupted by Shanna's giddy laughter, unable to understand how such a scoundrel was considered clean by the past ruler. She twitched in pain from the laughter, holding her stomach. Luther glared at her menacingly. The girl apologized and asked to continue her narrative. The king kept saying that there was no escape from the time current, and with this current, the seal was getting weaker and weaker. Even now he felt his heart was cracking, and it was about to burst into pieces. Luther put his hand to his chest. There was about a year left before it would be too late. He reached across the cage to Shanna, placing his palm against her silky hair. The only prophecy left that could save his sinful soul was that the place touched by the witch's hand would become new. That's why he needed Shanna. The girl brushed the former prince's hand away. The prophecy sounded too abstract, and even nonsensical in places. Luther had insisted that for that reason, everything that came to mind should be tried. The girl collapsed on her wooden bed, and interrupting the king and stretching, said that she needed to think. Getting married had always been considered a rather important event in life, which meant a lot of time was needed. Who knows if this wedding would turn out to be hell or a pathway to paradise? In reality, Shanna was trying to buy time for the emperor to leave and escape during the meal. And what would she do without the help of her familiar? Luther, on the other hand, was silently looking at the girl through the cage. Then he turned abruptly and declared, walking away toward the door, that there would be no more Castilla families in the Titan Empire. He would confiscate their property, and their servants would be sent into slavery. The count would be dealt with by hanging. After all, he is his servant, so he cannot refuse his majesty. Shanna panicked. She shouted after him that she promised him she would marry him, but the emperor only smirked and slammed the door shut. The manipulative plan had worked. She sank to her knees in despair, covering her face with her hands. She didn't know how she could buy time, for it was as if Luther could see right through her, no matter how hard she tried. Tears dripped from her golden eyes from the helplessness born of wondering what she could do to save her people. But the emperor did not think of executing anyone. His subjects were already gathered outside the door, whom he had ordered to serve his already named wife. The doors to Shanna's dungeon swung open, and several maidens stood before her in a single row, fully prepared to serve the only moon of the empire, for under the patronage of the goddess Aya, the Titan Empire would live forever. The girl understood everything. It was definitely the tricks of that beautiful scoundrel. He had definitely prepared in advance and decided that he would make her his empress, and the threats were to improve the effect. The maids took the witch to the spacious baths. Bright sunlight illuminated the spacious bathroom through gilded bars, and statues of lions peered around the edges of the room. The girls asked Shanna to lower her head a little so they could wash it. She obediently bent over, contemplating how she had gotten herself into such a horrible plot. In her 22 years of life, she'd never even stumbled into a relationship, and now she was marrying not even for love, but a guy who was threatening her family. It's like a blind date. The maid poured a jug of water over Shanna's long hair with trembling hands. Immediately the witch cried out that the water was too hot. The 7 girls knelt before her, tearfully and shiveringly apologizing for the misunderstanding. Baffled, Shanna in no way expected such a violent reaction, saying she was just scared and the water wasn't that hot. She realized that people had only 2 attitudes toward witches. Either they wanted to finish her off by putting her to fire or execution, or they were dying of fear. The second case was much more favorable, but it did not matter much now. The girl leaned against the rim of the bath, assuring the maids that she was fine, and then a bright idea came into her head. She said that in her goodness of heart and good spirit she would let them go, so they could go. The maids hesitated and looked at each other. His Majesty had ordered them to serve her at all times, so they couldn't just leave her alone. Then the girl, rubbing her fingers together, said that now she just needed the girl's fresh blood. It was rumoured that bathing in fresh pure blood made the skin impeccably soft. The girls trembled in horror as they recoiled from the witch. Shanna delighted in intimidating them, exclaiming that she was so grateful to the emperor for his generosity in sending her 7 noble maidens to bathe. The girls ran out of the bathroom in fear and screaming, leaving Shanna to fend for herself. The plan had worked perfectly. She could finally relax and use all the bathroom supplies, kindly left by the maids, on her own. The witch washed herself clean and wrapped in her robe called Raphael's name. The dog immediately appeared on the surface of the bathwater. The girl was startled to see him behind her, for she had expected him to enter through the window in the same way, simply by breaking it. The familiar, on the other hand, blushed once again, plunging into the water in surprise. He grumbled, amazed at Li Shanui's abnormality, not understanding why she had summoned him in such a place. Raphael explained that he was a familiar with water magic, so he could easily appear in the middle of clear water. Shanna snapped her fingers, noting that the skill was very useful, and she would use it all the time now, summoning Raphael in the bathroom. The familiar still couldn't get over the girl's shamelessness, but decided not to bring it up. It was necessary to get out now. Shanna exclaimed that she should tell him everything, because the situation was even more complicated than it seemed at first glance. She told him everything, and Raphael was horrified that Li Shana would now become empress in his mistress's body. Her endless troubles had no limit. At this rate, the only thing left to do was to burn herself. The constant troubles were giving the surname a headache. He had no idea that the imperial family had such a meaningless prophecy. It became clear that the witch would be persecuted even if she escaped to the other side of the world. And so there was nothing left to do but kill the emperor. Shanna looked at her unreasonable familiar with disapproval. This way, they would release the dragon power imprisoned in this guy, and then no one would survive. Eventually, the girl accepted Luther's proposal. On the day of the wedding, he met her in expensive attire and held out his hand, calming her down and telling her not to be nervous. It was humiliating. There was nothing wrong with the wedding because they needed it to safely break the seal. Anyway, Luther doesn't love Shanna Castile, but he also doesn't love the real her. The girl accepted the emperor's hand, and they walked together towards the clergyman. Before the wedding, Shanna made a small deal with Luther. While the priest mumbled a ceremonial speech, she remembered the conditions. For her part, she would not run away and would try to help him with the seal, and he, above all, was forbidden to touch her body. Shanna also wished for her personal maid Marie and guard Raphael to arrive at the palace. Of course, to stop her escape attempts, the emperor must swear not to threaten her family. Last but not least, the wedding kiss must be fake. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, turning to Luther. The priest announced that from now on, the sun and the moon of the empire would be one. But there was still no kiss. Only now did Li Shana know that in this world, kissing was not customary at weddings. Luther knew about it beforehand, but for some reason, he had agreed to this condition. Shanna blushed with embarrassment. This emperor definitely wanted to make her look awkward. Luther noticed Shanna's scornful look and, grinning, whispered to her to look forward. The servants and guests kneeled down to salute the newly crowned royal couple. Loud congratulations followed in the wake of the departing young men. People wished the Titan Empire eternal existence and protection, and Emperor Luther and Empress Shanna long life. And so it was the 4th day that Li Shana became empress. She sat in a luxurious stone gazebo, shrouded and surrounded by beautiful fragrant flowers, sipping tea. She was also watched by her personal maids from afar, afraid to approach. Although Li Shana now had a noble position, she was still who she was. Her thoughts were interrupted by the joyful Marie, who had finally arrived at the palace to see her dear miss. Shana was so happy to see her faithful maid, until she was distressed by her falling to her knees before her, greeting her already as the only moon of the empire. Mistress asked her not to embarrass her and to get up sooner, for she was no goddess in any way. Another familiar figure appeared behind Marie. It was the Count kneeling before Shana. The pink sword of Guard Castilla, in keeping with the symbols of the Castilla family, welcomed the new queen of the empire. It was the first time Shana had seen her father since that horrible messed-up coronation. After the festivities, she'd been at the palace the whole time, and she'd learned, quite by accident, that Guard was bedridden after being wounded, and she couldn't think that even after this he would be genuinely happy. He held a cup of tea in his hand, chatting carefree with his daughter and laughing. The Count told how His Majesty had confessed that after meeting Shana in the forest, he had fallen in love at first sight. And though he lavished the girl with gifts and letters full of his longing, the prince was saddened that he could not appear in person. The girl was embarrassed. Guard was amazed at what was happening all over again. Shana agreed smilingly, wondering what nonsense Luther had told his father. He also said that they were made for each other. His Majesty the Emperor was not the kind of person to throw such words around, so after hearing this, Guard, as Shana's uncle and father, could finally find peace. At the mention of her father, Li Shangar's image of her real father appeared in front of her eyes, causing her to feel confused and homesick. She decided to change the subject. The Count must have been surprised to hear that she was a witch. The girl asked to say whatever Guard wanted to say about it. He accepted the offer with a smile. The Count said confidently that even if he had to give his life for his daughter, he wouldn't care whether she was a witch or a saint. She was still his soulmate. He sternly asked Shana to keep in his memory forever that he would always be at her side. The Count is a wonderful man after all. The real Shana will surely be ashamed when she finds out about such selfless and strong love of the Count for her. The fact that Guard had helped her adjust to life as an empress reminded the girl of many things. Namely that she should be careful of Duke Ballard, the old man with the seaweed-coloured hair, and his children. Their clan is not only the first in the empire, but also the one who controls the economic vitality of the royal lands. It can be said without exaggeration that the entire market turnover is under their control. In other words, this family is the most reliable ally of the empire, and at the same time the only enemy of the crown, a kind of double-edged sword. Such people will go to any lengths to achieve their own goals. The Count stated that the sword was now a traitor. He waved his hand, ordering Marie to leave them, and continued his story. His Majesty believes that all the murders committed during the conquest of the South 3 years ago were built by the Duke. Before Luther ascended the throne and the former emperor was alive, the Ballard family had supported the 3 princes who died in an accident. It was not impossible that this murder was their handiwork. Shana didn't understand why Luther should be killed then, if the 3 princes were already dead. It would seem that they should be more favourable to him now. However, the Earl noted that the girl underestimated this crime family. In Guard's eyes, none of the Ballard children posed a sufficient threat, but not the Duke himself. At this point, Ballard himself was questioning his son Marcel with apparent superiority about his relationship with Princess Shana. The Duke was aware that his son had only been socialising with aristocrats lately. Because of that, Luther had come to their territory. But he had mentioned Empress Shana, so it was important for him to know the connection between them. Marcel stared fearfully at the floor, hesitating to raise his eyes to his stern father. With a tremor in his voice, he mumbled all the story he could remember. After listening to the entertaining story to the end, the Duke leisurely drew from his pipe and long exhaled tobacco smoke. He found this story extremely interesting, so he ordered an appointment with this witch to see how smart she was. Shana herself spent her days in her palace called the Crystal Rose, a white stately building surrounded by heavenly green gardens and fountains. Luther arrived at his empress's door, examining the large stack of books she had read in just 3 days. After all, in addition to the common language and ancient scripts of the empire, there were at least 3 languages of neighbouring countries. Shana felt disgusted, as if she had been suddenly attacked. The emperor spoke to her with such a nonchalant face as if nothing had happened. We can only wonder how the royal family could have such a winded bum." The girl calmly replied that it was just an appetizer for her. But in fact, it was the new magic of fast reading that should be thanked, which of course she didn't admit to. Luther looked at Shanna questioningly, not understanding what kind of appetizer she meant. The girl nervously explained that it was a dialect word meaning ease of execution. Then Luther put the book down and approached Shanna, talking about how amazing it was to hear dialect speech from the empress. It was indeed unusual. Shanna blushed and shyly averted her eyes, wryly saying that the reason was to get out of the house. She lives on the southern border, that's why she speaks like that. Not like some guy who doesn't even know his national dialect. The only thing on her mind was that Luther had clearly forgotten about the immunity clause. But the king stared at her in silence, pausing after a sarcastic remark. He pulled away, apologizing, clarifying that he hadn't demeaned her by speaking in dialect. Even though Shanna hadn't meant anything by it, and had just said it without thinking, she accepted the apology. Then Luther decided to get straight to the point, wondering when they would be married, because to break the seal, it was necessary to understand how to interpret the touch in the prophecy. They had been separated for 4 years, but this night, the girl would definitely be his. Shanna hurriedly interrupted Luther, unscrewing the scroll and loudly reading what it said. It spoke of the biggest disaster in the western part of the country in the last 3 years. With irritation in his voice, the emperor sat down in his chair and replied that the country was suffering great losses because of this. Not only had the West lost many settlements and livestock to natural disasters, but the constant sandstorms had contaminated the water in the wells. The rich have the opportunity to buy clean water, but a lot of people cannot afford it, so they settle for contaminated water, causing them to fall ill and die. To prevent this, and stop the deaths, the emperor ordered people to plant trees near the village yesterday, but it would take a long time for this method to work. Then Shanna decided that a universal way of filtering water for the poor was needed. She said she knew a simple method, so she asked Luther to pass the information to the West. It was a simple filter known to many, which Li Shanna had learned about in her natural history class, which unexpectedly proved useful at an unexpected moment. The filter is quite simple and accessible. You just need to place stones, small stones and sand in a bucket layer by layer, and fill it with water. In this way, the water will be purified, and all that remains is to boil it before use. The girl indulged in nostalgia for the lessons, remembering the filters they had made from plastic bottles. She could also use magic to plant trees, but for that, she would have to go to the village in person and cast a spell. Besides, one could ask Raphael if there were magic words for purifying water. He was in control of the element, so he must be aware of it. Luther thought about Shanna's not bad suggestions, and then he smiled softly, sincerely thanking his empress for her help. Shanna's heart suddenly beat faster. Luther said goodbye to his empress before dinner and left her chambers. As soon as he left, Shanna put her hand to her chest, not sure why her heart was racing. She denied that this could have happened because of that narcissistic boy's smile. Even though she might be embarrassed by his unimaginable beauty, love was ruled out. His list of blunders included kidnapping, attempted burning, binding, even forced marriage. And for all that, there was no way she could settle down, which disappointed her. Raphael appeared in his mistress's chambers, informing her that Duke Ballard was desperate to meet her in person soon. Crunching her cookies, Shanna wondered what this was all about, since not long ago he'd insisted on burning her just like everyone else. To Raphael, everyone was equally unpleasant. Both the emperor and the duke annoyed him. Shanna agreed, but singled out the only outlet in the imperial court. What delicious food was served here. She generously offered to taste the cookies to Marie as well, but she modestly declined. It was against the rules. The maid decided to ask if Shanna was frightened. Mistress is facing a face-to-face meeting with a duke who doesn't wish her well. He is a terrible man, even with the powers he possesses. Marie said that not long ago, the group of businessmen who had opposed him had broken up. The organization belonged to Count Silandi, who was supported by the nobleman Luosai. But at one point, half of the count's wealth was lost, and the head of the organization was killed along with his family. Oddly enough, Shanna was encouraged by this upcoming encounter. the very real chance to punish one for the edification of the other. The girl told Marie to tell Emperor Luther that dinner would be an hour late, got up from her seat, and headed for the exit. Raphael stopped the girl, unfastening his tie. She needed to prepare and replenish her magic, so he was ready to lend her his ticklish body, as he had before. Shanna was touched by such aggressive care and attention. She immediately took out the unfortunate feather and started the prank. Finally, the Duke himself came to the palace, accompanied by servants. It was a surprise to him that Shanna had accepted the invitation so readily. The more obvious outcome would have been that she would simply ignore or avoid him. But the door swung open as if it had been eagerly awaiting his arrival. Ballard took a knee, bowing and saluting the Empire's only moon, introducing himself as Johannes Lou Ballard. Shanna looked fearlessly at the guest from the height of her majesty, calmly seated on the throne. The Duke's mind flashed with the thought that Marcel was not mistaken. The girl really knew no fear. Ballard, first of all, apologized for the incident that had occurred at the banquet, but he was more interested in the story he had heard from his youngest son. A sinister smile appeared on the Duke's face. Marcel told him about the first time he'd seen Shanna a few months ago. That night he had secretly, furtively borrowed his brother's favourite horse and had gotten lost while riding through a field under a starry sky. A mysterious beam of light caught his attention, and he decided to approach it. At the moon altar, after the light disappeared, he saw Shanna looking at him with a smile. Her smile was icy and touching. She had told him that this place was not for aristocrats, but Marcel's arrival had come at a good time. The girl was bored here alone. Shanna's favourite dog was locked up, so she needed someone to listen to her. Looking at the beautiful maiden with curly, bloody hair, Marcel blushed. The girl introduced herself as Shanna, but afterward, she said that she would become Li Sha-Noi. The Empress was distressed by this story. It turns out that she was not chosen as a target at random, but had always been one. Afterward, Shanna often chatted with Ballard Jr. and talked about longing to leave this disgustingly boring world and go to a different one that matched her true self. Li Sha-Na didn't understand what the Duke was getting at. He smirked and said that it seemed that the witch's plan to go to this utopian world had failed, so she was coveting first an empire and then an entire continent. Ballard suggested that the Empress unite. The benefit was obvious. She would not only be the Emperor's wife, but she would also be the one with real power. The girl was disappointed by the proposal, and she put her fist to her head in boredom. It turns out that the Duke has no idea that the real Shanna's plan has been successfully carried out. He and his unwise son equally think that she is the real Shanna Castilla. Naturally, for his part, the Duke also offered a share in the bargain. His son Marcel, the very one who had locked up Shanna and forcibly desired her love, had done so in a fit of strong feelings. Ballard added that he had also committed enough crimes to send him to the guillotine, but he would give it to the Empress instead. Shanna coughed in surprise, not even wanting to ask what the Duke was offering her now. It was now in her will to decide his fate, to execute him or to make him her subject, simply put, a call boy. In case the Empress was still in doubt, Ballard offered to put his daughter at her disposal, for she had behaved very rudely toward Shanna at the banquet. The girl was being worshipped by a horrible man. He literally sold his children to cover up his own mistakes. He kept the heir, the eldest son, close to him. With a smile, the Duke finished by wishing the Empire prosperity, and that if the Empress accepted his proposal, the Ballard clan would be eternally loyal to her will. Shanna's inner voice shouted about the Duke's shamelessness, spicing it up with swear words. But the girl indifferently and arrogantly replied that the proposal was not worth the gamble. With a soft smile, she compared the Duke to a beggar. Tho frowned and wanted to object, but suddenly clouds appeared above him and cold rain poured right into the room. Shanna went on to say that all it takes is determination to take the life of the person you long to kill the most. Most likely, the Duke had naively assumed that she would agree to such foolishness. She shamed him, noting that even if the aristocrats treated him differently, to her he was just as aristocratic. A dog that pounces on its master is worthless. With those words, Shanna ushered the Duke out the door and sighed in relief. The meeting had been tiring, so she wished she had something sweet to eat. She wondered if she had overstepped her bounds. But on the other hand, This scoundrel had dared to make an outrageous proposal. Still, she should have thought twice before turning down such a powerful man. The Empress brushed the intrusive thoughts away, determined that if she encountered such a thing next time, she would be less impulsive. She rose from her throne seat and made her way to dinner with Luther. Deep into the night in his mansion, Duke Ballard was restless, gazing thoughtfully out the window overlooking the front of the estate. Maylin noticed her father's unhealthy complexion and asked if anything had happened at the palace today. Ballard left his daughter's question unanswered. Instead, he called his eldest son Edmund. The Duke ordered that from now on the economy of the Western territories would be the responsibility of the eldest son, who was obliged to return 10 times as much money to his father. Similarly, while distracted from his work, Ballard tried to distract himself from the pesky thoughts of the impudent girl who was causing him so much trouble. Shanna relieved her tension by spending time in the bathhouse of her estate. The water was especially pleasant today, with a refreshing light scent of lavender. Admittedly, she would miss living such a luxurious life when she got back. Raphael stood by his side and irritatedly wondered how his mistress would react when she returned to her world. Li Shana had managed to insult the powerful duke without saying 2 words, to which Li Shana childishly replied that he had started it first. Besides, she didn't think he'd be so direct. In his position, he should have been much more tactful. The girl ate the fresh apples and glanced at her servant. Raphael warned Li Shanu not to relax, but she had plans to discuss it with His Majesty today. It was late in the afternoon, and he thought the girl had misspoken, but she shocked him by saying that she would stay with the Emperor tonight. Raphael rushed toward the girl and blocked her path, exclaiming that this was out of the question. She must have forgotten that this was not her body. It belonged to the last witch of the Castilla family. He took her by the shoulders, trying to reason with her, and she couldn't love this guy while describing him as a less than trustworthy person. This kind of thing can only be done when both parties have deep feelings for each other. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. Li Shana stopped her familiar, putting her fingers to his lips and making a face full of disappointment at her servant's intellectual abilities. He was thinking of unacceptable things. Eventually, the familiar was tied up like a mummy, and Shanna ordered Marie to keep an eye on him. At first, they thought the same thing, but marriage can't be treated as just child's play, and marital duty can't be put off. The more the Emperor and Shanna spent time together, the less rumours began to surface that they had only been lovers since he was still a prince. The anger emanating from these people was palpable. They think that Shanna is a witch using her magic to bewitch the Emperor and bend him to her will. It was not surprising. They had been living in separate rooms since their marriage, and Shanna drank tea and devoured books one after another, day after day, alone. It is not surprising that the Duke, despite her status, makes risky proposals, say, since the imperial box Shanna does not like, so at least let her son please him, if she likes it. He knew that the Empress does not get along with the Emperor, so with the help of Marcel wanted to make her his puppet. The exertion gave Shanna a headache. She had completely forgotten that instead of playing the game of survival, she should rather find a way home. The blame lay squarely on the real Shanna, the one who had taken her body and her life with unseen magic. Li Shana angrily clenched her fists, causing a nearby flower pot to shatter from the negative energy. The servants bowed their heads and tremblingly asked the Empress to calm down. But she calmly told the Emperor that she would spend tonight with him. Shanna was to blame for the way things had turned out, so she didn't understand why she had to protect this witch. The girl laughed, fully confident of her superiority, though she had no experience in love at all. Her jubilation was interrupted by a maid who said that His Majesty had been waiting for her in his chambers for an hour. Shanna immediately went to her husband. The Emperor's chambers were mottled with patterns on snow-white walls, covered by scarlet curtains to the floor, impeccable decorations worthy of His Majesty. Shanna coughed, alerting him that she had entered. Shyly, the girl pulled back the curtains that blocked the Emperor's bed from the light and said she needed to talk to him about how best to set up a show of great deception in the palace. But Luther was lying on the bed in his robe, already having his 10th dream. The girl crouched gingerly on the edge of the bed, muttering that the boy had made her nervous over nothing. Luther looked very tired. Of course, it was not easy to manage such a large empire. The girl smiled softly and started to consider the former prince, having a great opportunity. Her cheeks lit up with a blush, as she thought of how handsome he was. If only his temper could match his beautiful face. Shanna stood up and stretched. It looked like she would sleep on the couch tonight and put off talking about the Duke until tomorrow morning. At that moment, the still sleepy emperor opened his eyes, noticing that his dear witch had come to his chambers. Luther rose up in his bed, rubbing his head. He had indeed fallen asleep waiting for his wife. Suddenly, there was a rumbling sound. The emperor got up from the bed and led Shanna away, sleeping soundly on the floor. She didn't even seem to have reached the couch. The morning came quickly. The girl woke up abruptly, finding herself in bed right in front of Luther himself, sleeping peacefully across the room. She was afraid to even guess why she was lying next to him. The most innocuous answer was that he'd seen her huddled on the couch and carried her over to him. He shouldn't care for her like that. She decided it would be better if he slept alone and tried to get up. But suddenly Luther pounced on her, hovering over her, asking why she was avoiding him. It was obvious that everyone in the palace doubted the authenticity of their relationship. He didn't do anything because he cared about her feelings, but since even the Duke had begun to act, Luther could not remain indifferent. He touched his forehead to Shanna's forehead and said he wouldn't force her to do anything, but they needed to get closer to each other. Shanna frowned and exclaimed that she had told him 100 times not to touch her. With those words, she slammed her head into the emperor's forehead. The blow was so severe that the palace physician, Mai Kun, had to be summoned. The doctor said they were both slightly bruised, so an ice compress would take care of the pain for a few hours. The couple thanked the healer, glancing at each other disdainfully. There was an awkward silence among the servants, for whom the emperor and empress's hatred for each other was evident. Luther said he would be alone with his wife today, so everyone should leave them alone. The servants left the room, whispering and discussing the bad relationship between the couple. It was time to eat, and the appetizing table was already set for Shanna and Luther only. Eating the excellent steak, the girl recognized the emperor's rightness. She promised to try to pretend that they were in love. In that case, Luther asked to be called Rune. It was his childhood name, given by his mother, and also the easiest way to prove that Shanna was special to him. The witch, in turn, admitted that her real name was Li Sha-na. At this point, she finished revealing the truth about herself and refused to answer any other questions. With a chuckle, the emperor asked if there was any difference, for the names were very consonant. Li Sha-na angrily put the wineglass on the table, exclaiming that there was a big difference. Since his favourite wife said so, then it must be true. Luther swirled the wine in his glass and set it carefully on the table, smiling softly. His face alone showed his dodgy character. Shanna did not give in to the emperor's game of talking about how gracious his majesty was, pouring champagne into her glass. The pretense made them both laugh. Several servants, including Raphael, stood at the door to their quarters. The couple could be heard flirting with each other, though not sincerely. Shanna had already had too much to drink, even though she denied it. Her cheerfulness and carefree attitude only irritated Raphael more. At night, by the light of the growing moon at the topmost window of the tower, Raphael watched his mistress and the emperor, pondering what was going on in his soul. He only followed this girl to protect his mistress's body, and since she's a person from another world who's just using Shanna's appearance. But he was plagued with speculation as to why he felt so sick and lousy. The familiar was overcome with a variety of feelings: anger, resentment, and the unfortunate, unfounded jealousy he had admitted to himself. After Shanna and Luther decided to get close, a lot of time passed. All this period they went to dances, wore paired clothes in the same style every day. The result exceeded all expectations. The court finally recognized them as a couple and realized that the rumors of discord were empty. The reason was their deep connection from back when His Majesty was a prince. The couple clinked glasses of red wine, celebrating their excellent wagering in front of the crowd. Luther noted that although Shanna had acted awkwardly at first, she was now playing naturally. The girl said with a laugh that she still had a long way to go, but now the party was just an appetizer for her. But 8 hours later, she no longer felt that way, emitting a gasp of exhaustion on her bed, complaining of exhaustion. The emperor sat back and relaxed, reading the denunciation scrolls on his chair, and laughing at the way Shanna boasted that she was already used to the rhythm, and such activities were like a light snack for her. Without moving, the girl faintly threatened to blow up the palace if it was the same tomorrow. It had been a whole month, and she was so exhausted. Luther corrected that it hadn't been that long, but it felt like 3 months had already passed. The emperor propped his head up with his fist. He was sorry to hear his wife say that, because he was happy to spend time with her. There were no plans for tomorrow, and the rumours had died down, so Shanna could let you rest for a few days. With a misty look, the girl mumbled that she had to attend a tea party with the aristocrats. Luther told her to cancel it, but the chosen one had already snickered. And while she was already travelling through the realm of Morpheus, he informed her that the filtering method that the witch had taught people in the West was working. When he heard no answer, he called out affectionately as Shanu. Luther quietly stood up and gently laid the girl's head on the pillows, looking at her carefully with a gentle smile. The idyll was interrupted by the door opening, revealing a wolf with different eyes. At his feet lay several corpses of mercenaries, probably planning an assassination attempt on his mistress and his majesty. Luther wasn't the least bit frightened and recognized Shanna's familiar by his eyes. Legend has it that after a witch's servant receives his master's magic, his eyes will turn different colors. What's more, Raphael saved them a lot of trouble. After that banquet, the killers never showed up. The faithful dog took care of everything. The emperor turned away and headed toward Shanna again, praising the familiar for a job well done. But then Raphael grabbed him by the neck. With an angry look in his eyes, he threatened Luther not to touch Shanna. It didn't matter if he had a magical dragon in his body or something worse, he'd kill him for her anyway. Luther looked at the familiar with a blank stare, noting that Raphael was overdoing it with the jokes. The emperor was serious though, as his sword reliquary appeared behind him, ready to attack. Luther's eyes rolled, and now the familiar flew off in the opposite direction. But here was the trouble. The emperor was on his knee, panting again. It was probably the seal doing that to his body. The rumbling woke up to the cause of the argument. Shanna opened the curtains, wondering indignantly what the two of them were doing here late at night. The girl caught an unpleasant picture. Both men, who are always by her side, were not in the best condition and sat on the floor with their heads bowed. Raphael coughed and covered his mouth with his hand, holding back the blood that came from hitting the wall. Shanna ran up to him anxiously, offering her help. Then, hugging her familiar, she decided to throw her emotions out at the emperor, reprimanding him for bullying her pup. It was as if the former prince wasn't even listening to her, looking somewhere else with a blank stare. Shanna frowned and repeated that the condition of their marriage was the safety of the people of the Castilla family. If this happened again, she would divorce him. But Luther, instead of objecting, called Shanu's trembling voice by name, holding his heart. The marble floor of the palace began to crack under his hand. The destruction began to spread rapidly through the building. This was bad. Shanna immediately forgot about her familiar and rushed to Rune, pulling him against her. His breathing was unrhythmic and hoarse. Moreover, it was the first time the girl had seen how marble could shatter so easily like paper. The dragon seal seemed to be overpowering him. The girl tried to shout to the emperor, informing him that if this continued, all life on earth would perish. But Luther, with pain in his eyes, asked for the very touch of the witch, weakly grasping her clothes. But Li Shana had no idea how to interpret this prophetic madness. She could have used the elements or lightning as her magic. Rune felt as if he were being torn from the inside, and he let out a cry of pain as he weakly begged the girl to do something. He was no longer able to contain the curse within him. Shanna hugged her husband tightly, straining her panicked mind, searching for the answer to how the witch's hand should touch his heart, for it was not at all necessary that the prophecy have a direct meaning. Suddenly, it hit her. In all the fairy tales, the kiss of true love had powerful magical properties. She leaned toward Luther, pulling him to her, daring him to take a risky action. Their lips were so close, all that was left was to give in. She didn't own the body anyway, and the effort was worth a lot of lives. But suddenly she was embarrassed and squealed that she couldn't do it, slapping poor Rune with a savoury slap. The strike was followed by the appearance of a golden seal that surrounded the couple on all sides. A tall, sparkling column of light rose up, reaching all the way to the sky. Servants ran to the emperor, preparing for the worst possible outcome. But His Majesty was more than all right. In his place on the bed was an exhausted Shanna, who had used up all her magic. Luther motioned for the servants to leave the room, and the girl complained of headaches as she opened her eyes. Pesky offers of help followed from all sides. Both Luther and Raphael vied for her attention, trying to do their part to help her not get better. Shanna stopped the altercation between her adoring friends. She'd used up all her energy saving them, and they hadn't even bothered to bring her a glass of water. Luther, with a calm face, told Marie, who was already at the door, to go through. It turned out they had already carefully prepared her favourite drink. Raphael handed Shanna a cup, and she thanked them. As she drank, Luther noted the girl's wise choice to punch him in the face. The witch choked on that statement. The slap really worked perfectly. After receiving the powerful magic, the sword changed and became stronger. It didn't solve the problem, but it improved the situation many times over. The girl's eyes immediately sparkled. If that was the case, a few preventive slaps would be in order. Luther obediently agreed with her sadistic decisions. All Shanna had to do was replenish the magic, tickle Raphael and build up enough energy for Rune. It seemed like she could actually avert disaster. The witch's touch could save the continent from imminent doom by breaking the seal. So it turns out the prophecy really isn't fiction. But something was bothering Shanna, and while she was tormented by her twisted fate, the West was in turmoil. The poor people bowed at the feet of Ballard's eldest son, begging him not to destroy what gave them hope of survival. The area was very arid, and water was scarce. Several dozen people had already died of dehydration in the past. The settlement was poor, so even their plates are worth their weight in gold. And if the Lord destroyed the filters, they wouldn't even have the stones to rebuild them. Edmund Lou Ballard was unwilling to listen to the empty cries of his subordinates. In cold blood, he ordered everything to be burned so that the people could not use the resources again. People shouted helplessly, trying to dissuade Edmund, but his servants kicked every loud peasant violently with their feet. They had no right even to look at the young duke. All the structures blazed brightly as Edmund announced that the peasants should now pay even more taxes, tenfold, and whether it was the sale of property or their own children. Returning to his estate, the elder Ballard reflected that his father had also gone too far. He was surprised that he had sent him to the frontier, for such measures would surely make people lose heart. And the girl, Li Shana or Shanna, it doesn't matter, has gotten in the way. And if she doesn't like it, she'll definitely gather all the aristocrats to rally against the Duke. That was already obvious based on what happened at the banquet. A bunch of cowards were just scared of lightning and curses, so they kept silent. And yet Edmund wondered why, under such conditions, he would inherit the house in the future. At the height of his discontent, he was interrupted by his younger brother Marcel. He said he had done his brother's errand. He had destroyed every single filter, big and small. Marcel marvelled at Shanna's abilities, for she had saved the beggars in the West using only a stone. Ballard had planned for Shanna to appear in person in the West after what had happened, and Marcel was looking forward to it. He really liked the witch, and her beauty was the first thing that caught his eye. Edmund recognised that. Marcel was mesmerised by the memory of Shanna absorbing the moonlight. He'd been foolish last time, threatening a bonfire if she didn't marry him. But Marcel had realised that marriage wasn't that important, and this time he would act differently. He planned to tie her to his bed for the rest of his life and always be there for her. Exclaiming that he would be near her soon, Ballard Jr. stretched his hands toward the sky as if calling out to his beloved. During this time, Shanna spent her time in the imperial library, accompanied by her husband and familiar, rummaging through ancient books. None of them were suitable for her problem, but she did not despair and continued her search. She couldn't torture her men for long, but the methods of restoring magic she had were proven. The first bore the name direct access, and depending on the intensity of people's fear or excitement, she could restore her manor to the end. The second method, on the other hand, involved having to get others to do it, but indirect access was not as effective. Li Shana could only be responsible for Rune, so she instructed Mari to take care of it. But the dog was adamantly opposed, saying that he would only let Shanna do such things to him. Raphael's mind flicked to the wooden scroll that had supposedly slipped out of Luther's hands by accident, shifting his attention to his person. The Emperor assured Shanna that the seal was stable now, so she could deal with other matters, and showed her a message from the Western lands. The report stated that the efficiency of the drinking water filter that was created by her wisdom was impressive. Wine barrels served as the vessel, and thanks to His Majesty, they were able to install them. However, the aristocrats had recently started destroying these structures because people weren't paying taxes. This was terrible news for the empress. Luther also said that the duke had recently sent his heir to the west. The lord's influence is the greatest in the county, and yet he is one of the most disgusting aristocrats. The girl flared up and decided to personally move west immediately. It didn't matter if she was using magic or something else, but the problem needed to be solved immediately. Raphael calmed his mistress's fervour, noting that it was late, so it was pointless to leave, since it would take about 10 days on a leash. And that was on condition that there would be the fastest horses and a first-class carriage, as was proper for an empress. But the girl proudly decided that it was her duty, for the country was under her care. Luther suddenly said that there was a quick way to get to the west, but a very dangerous one. In contrast, Shanna said narcissistically and confidently that there was no one more dangerous than her in this empire. Rune grinned. It was mortifying to him to see such a selfless reaction, and he opened the secret passage by pulling a book in the shelf. The wall seemed to part on its own, revealing a passage to a secret basement room. They walked down the stone stairs, lighting their way with magic. Shanna stared at the room in fascination, talking about having seen something like this in the movies. Nearly getting caught again, she added that it was also a dialect expression, meaning something like a theatre. The imperial family had arrived. A real and whole witch's moon altar appeared in front of the girl. It was amazing to her how such things could survive in the palace catacombs. The answer was simple. The altar was built back when there was peace between the empire and the witches. The outside of such structures are completely ruined, but this altar has survived, apart from the cracks caused by old age. You can use it to get to the west quickly, but only a witch can activate it. Rune asked if Shanna could handle it, and the girl realized that the moonstone and displacement magic was used by the real Shanna Castilla, and if she could do it, she could definitely do it. Then Luther began to guide the girl. It was necessary to stand in the middle and join hands in a certain way. He stood behind and helped the girl to do everything correctly. There was no moonlight in the basement, so they had to imitate it with magic. Shanna began to read the glowing inscriptions on the stones, which were incomprehensible to Luther. Suddenly the inscriptions began to flow in rivers through the air, lighting up the space and raising the wind. The magic began to take effect. The memories left in his body were making themselves felt. One line after another was read, and others appeared in her mind. Shanna thanked Rune for helping her. We wonder how he knew such an effective method. What a witch in the guise of an emperor! The girl marvelled until she noticed Rune approaching her with a serious expression. Luther kissed the girl gently on the forehead, wishing she would come back soon, or he would miss her. Shanna didn't even have time to be indignant, but disappeared into the glow of the altar, holding her forehead. The satisfied Luther chuckled, then averted his eyes, blushing. It seemed that this step was just as difficult for him. He had to get back to his office too, and the girl appeared in the air already in the right place, and threatening Luther with reprisal, realized that she was falling down. She had forgotten that she could use wind magic. The landing was surprisingly soft. She'd been lucky to fall right onto the fresh green grass, but underneath her soft spot was that creepy youngest son of Ballard's. He probably followed his older brother. He had to leave before he woke up. But on the other hand, Shanna asked herself if she'd come here to teach these cruel aristocrats a lesson. Marcel ran away from Shanna, trying to justify himself in the most ridiculous ways. He shouted that his older brother had made him do it, and he didn't want to hurt Shanna. The empress, however, was restless. She chased Marcel childishly and shouted back that he should be punished for his actions and be afraid of her and the people here, who were now grieving because of him. Shanna's breathing gradually hitched and her head began to spin. In such a weak body, she couldn't keep up with the guy, and using magic on him was too wasteful. She had no choice but to use the last resort. It was the whip Marie had given her for self-defense. Shanna was a novice, but she could do a few things, and that was more than enough. The girl swung at Marcel and slapped him several times on his soft spots, taking her anger out on him. After beating the guy to exhaustion, Shanna crouched on a rock, examining the weapon of her salvation. The sensation was unforgettable, though different from magic. Marcel, frightened and mangled, lay on the ground, shielding himself from the angry witch. He cried and mumbled about how he had been so hard all this time, both on the day of the engagement and the coronation. It had been hard for him not to speak to her, but now that his father had authorized their relationship, she wanted to nail him on the day of their long-awaited reunion. Shanna tolerated his remarks, but couldn't stand it, and stripped the guy down to his underwear with the help of magic. There was only one scrap of cloth left before the full shame, and the girl threatened to tear it if Marcel didn't shut up. The witch ordered the poor man to tell all that was going on in each village, and the younger Ballard obediently complied with her wish. As it turned out, the aristocrats had indeed destroyed all the water filters with their own hands. Marcel was responsible for the last village. In addition, Shanna quibbled over the kidnapping of all the beauties of the village. But it turned out that it wasn't the beauties that had been dragged away to the residence, but the handsome ones. Marcel smilingly pointed out that their father was unaware of the fact that Edmund preferred more privacy with men. Shanna awkwardly imagined the lustful scenes of their seclusion, but immediately dismissed the horrible thoughts. Marcel sucked up and insisted that he only liked his darling Shanna, for which his last piece of cloth was torn with a whip. The girl was aware of the situation, but seeing it with her own eyes was far more unpleasant. It was known that life here was already hard to imagine, and now some group of villains had taken the men and destroyed the only source of clean drinking water needed to sustain life. Li Shana raised her hand upwards, channeling the full power of her magic to the heavens. The sky was covered with clouds, and heavy rain poured down on the arid lands of the west. The people went out in joy, right under the falling drops of cool water. Even though the filters had been destroyed, it was the lack of drinking water that was the main problem. 20 minutes should have been enough time for the people to collect rainwater. Magic would not be enough for more. In addition, energy was also needed to help the saplings grow faster, so that the trees could help the soil retain moisture better. It also made sense to send the filters left at the palace here, as well as to monitor how the nobles here were taking care of their people. It was a lot of work, but the first priority was to replenish the magic. Shanna ordered Marcel to take her to his brother, and then they arrived at their family's small local castle. Beside Ballard's eldest son, servants sat on their knees, and men in half-open costumes performed in front of him, performing dances suitable to Oriental dances. But Edmund was bored with everything. He dressed these men in city clothes, but they exuded the energy of rednecks. He had them sold on the black slave market. The men exclaimed, not understanding what was their fault. But it was the best fate, showing the young duke's favour to them, for if they had danced badly, he would have killed them. A noise was heard outside the door. The guards could not restrain the lady, who was persistently trying to enter the chambers of the lord. One of the guards ran into the hall, telling Edmund to hide and informing him that they had encountered a strong woman. Before he could finish speaking, his armour disappeared along with his clothes, leaving him in just his underwear and embarrassing Edmund. Shanna, after using the whip a few times, realised why Mari had been so insistent that she take it. There was very little magic in this weapon, but it was far more useful than a sword. And it was masterful at stripping the guards of their clothes. Embarrassed guards rushed to the corners, begging to keep some of their clothes intact. There were so many victims that the magic was overwhelming the rambunctious girl's body. Shanna demanded to be let in immediately before she burned all their hair. The empress stormed into the hall to Edmund, who had already rolled off his throne in terror, and threatened that if he wished to retain his dignity, he must kneel before her. As expected, the castle was easily captured. Shanna took the elder Ballard's place and accepted honours and thanks from his former servants. The people had no idea who she was, but promised not to forget her favour. They had been living in this land for generations, but they didn't even know the name of their emperor. And naturally, they would have no way of knowing who had come to visit them. Shanna planned to hide her identity, so she made up another story that she was a Bailey Knight of the Bailey Strom Dukes, a confidant of the emperor. On His Majesty's orders, she was sent west to restore order. The Ballard family is no match for their family, so the servants were not to be bothered. The story sounded dubious and improbable, but people were ready to believe anything that came out of the mouth of the beautiful saviour. It was the first time they had seen such an unusual knight using a whip as a weapon. The lie was filigree, and yet where was it seen that knights destroyed armour using an ordinary whip? But the girl was very happy, and it did not embarrass her in the slightest. People would not call the one who saved their lives a cruel witch. But what was strange was that in a country where a witch could become empress, they were being exterminated. And then Shanna said that the current empress could use magic. The people knew only that God had given His Majesty such power, but they had not heard of the witch empress. There were differences, though, and Shanna decided to let them see what that magic looked like. She excused herself by saying that she saw the empress often, and the empress had kindly taught her a few tricks. There was no joy on the people's faces. Instead, a perplexed whisper was heard in the crowd. Shanna had only 3 days to change the reaction of these people into a favourable one. During this remarkable time, both of Ballard's sons were imprisoned in a dungeon and chained to the wall. Marcel shared with his brother that he felt weirder with each blow from Shanna, but Edmund cited the witch's curse. For 3 days, Shanna used these guys secretly to replenish magic and channeled powers to help the peasants. With her stored energy, she summoned rain, used lightning to break large rocks into smaller ones for filters. Also together with Raphael, they were growing trees. The position for the spell was very tight, but Rafe explained that the magic for planting trees, unlike fire magic, was very difficult. Plus, the energy was drawn from their hearts, and the closer they were to each other, the more likely they were to succeed. Li Sha-na tightened her grip on her surname, causing his heart to beat more and more frequently. He whispered and wondered when his attitude towards the one he didn't think of as his mistress began to change. Indeed, the trees immediately soared upward, greening everything around them and creating an oasis of paradise in the middle of the desert, pleasing the people. Shanna stretched, sighing in relief. The business was finished, and although it was quite tiring, it was also very satisfying. She thanked Raphael for her new knowledge, which came in handy for helping her. In the future, someone will need to run this place and create new filters, so it would be nice if they used this to change people's perception of witches, as well as come up with countermeasures to prevent the Duke from retaliating. Both decided that Luther would handle it best, and with a laugh, Raphael supported the idea, only adding more work for the Emperor. There was still one piece of unfinished business, namely their common goal. The moon was already rising above the earth, and Shanna arrived, riding her wolf to the lunar altar. Raphael thought that Shanna had decided to return to the palace, but she might have wasted her strength from fatigue. Li Sha-na, on the other hand, insisted that it had to be done tonight, because the moon on this night looked most like the one described by Duke Ballard's youngest son. It was on such a moonlit night that Shanna Castilla exchanged bodies with her. The girl was unconsciously drawn to this place, so she decided to do her best and headed for the altar. Now that she knew how to do it, Li Sha-na decided to return to her real world, driving Raphael into a panicked state of bewilderment. Li Sha-na held out letters to Raphael for everyone who wasn't with her right now. One was written to the surname himself, and there were several others for the Count and Rune. If successful, the real Shanna Castilla would return to her world. The girl bequeathed to her that if she ever tried to do such a foolish thing again, there would be no mercy for her. But Shanna was sure that Raphael would be able to stop her this time. The butler exclaimed that even he didn't know what kind of magic his mistress had used, and she couldn't possibly remember such a thing. Shanna touched the moonstone. She said that after she was here, she realized that she could easily read all the spells written here. Last night, an idea had occurred to her. Movement spells could be slightly modified. That's probably what Shanna Castilla did. Raphael insisted that it was extremely dangerous. Shanna could easily use magic only because she was in her mistress's body. The magic of displacement was not so simple, and in case of a slip, the girl's soul would risk getting lost between dimensions. The dog put his hand on Shanna's arm, trying to stop her. He didn't stop her for no reason, but the girl insisted that if Shanna could pull this off, so could she. Li Sha-na was inexplicably attached to this body. At first, she wanted to adapt and find a way to return, but as time passed, she would change her plans and stay put. In this daily game of Empress, she began to forget who she really was. With a wistful look in her eyes, she said that she couldn't be Miss Shanna Castilla. She is none other than a university student named Li Sha-na, and Raphael knows that better than anyone. The girl covered her eyes. She realized that if she returned to the palace now, her heart would start to doubt again. Therefore, putting it off was no longer possible. The more time passed, the more she regretted her decisions. Raphael squeezed Shanna's hand. He said that she really wasn't his mistress. They were nothing like each other at all. Mistress always ignored what she had and followed a utopian illusion. Beneath her, the dog was but a shadow waiting for orders. It seemed as if that was the way it should be. But with Sha Noi, it was different. The days spent with her were slowly forcing him to change, and in those times he saw no shadows of his mistress. Raphael grabbed Shanna's hand with both hands, not wanting to let go. He pressed her hand to his chest and admitted that he liked the girl. Shanna stared at her familiar, unable to believe her ears. She asked again, and he repeated it again. Li Shana refused to accept this confession, which was more of an interjection. Then Raphael blurted out confidently and firmly that he loved her. It seems he was sick, as the girl assumed, but sick he was of his mistress. He admitted with annoyance that he liked someone whose real face he had never even seen. But suddenly the confession was cut short by the red glow that covered the moonstone. Shanna hadn't even begun to read the spell yet, but somehow the stone began to work. A scarlet pillar of light rose up. In different corners of the world, magic transferred to each moonstone, and the altars began to collapse one by one. Raphael shielded his lover from the blasts until she irritably ordered him to let her go. There was only one guess as to what the red light was, but with horror, the two discovered that the moon altar in front of them had been destroyed. Shanna was just getting ready to use her powers, but the magic that had just been here was not hers. The stone was probably just too old, and now they would have to travel about 10 days to get back to the palace. Raphael realized what had just happened. With annoyance, he said that most likely the other witches had used very powerful magic to destroy all the moonstones on the continent. Raphael rushed off, carrying his mistress on his back. Shanna had no idea where he was taking her. He was heading towards the palace. Since there was also a moonstone beneath it, choosing it to move would be the safest solution. But that strange red light was also heading there. It turns out that there are other witches besides Li Sha Nui. Only for a moment did Raphael feel a cold breath. He could unmistakably tell that it belonged to his mistress's magic. Shortly before the colour red appeared, Luther sat at the large window, reading scrolls under the moonlight. Today it felt colder than usual. Rune went down to the secret basement, once again waiting for his empress. Every day from morning until dusk, he waited impatiently for her return. But it seems his beloved won't be back tonight. Marie pretended to be her for 3 days, lying in bed. The emperor himself had survived 3 days without her, pining each time he sat alone at the table and regretting that he had let her go. He never imagined she would become so important to him, a special girl unlike any other. He had always assumed that this light that surrounded Shanna were the effects of her magic. But now he realized he was wrong. It is her own light, unique train of thought and fearlessness. No matter what happens, Shanna will always move forward. He couldn't speculate if, once the seal was broken, she would leave him. Even though she was already the empress of these lands, Luther had a strong feeling that Shanna might just leave. Sadly, he placed his hand on the moon altar, realizing that the void in his heart could not be filled by anyone but her. He wished that his beloved would return to him soon. Suddenly the red light reached this altar as well, illuminating the dark basement with bright rays. Luther stared at the girl who had suddenly appeared in front of him. She fell right into his arms. Luther wrapped her in his cloak, protecting her from the crumbling altar. Dust rose, and the boy, coughing, found the unknown girl in his arms. Rung took her to the chambers. Until Shanna returns, no one must see this girl. The moonstone had been destroyed, so the return of the lady would be delayed. Count Castilla had to be informed to help Shanna return and rest. Mari listened to the order and bowed. Luther glanced at the stranger sleeping on the bed. She could have been sent by Shanna, but there had been no word from the empress. But the moonstone could only be used by witches to move. So this girl must be a member of their society too. Better be careful. Rune ordered Mari to keep an eye on her, and when she wakes up, she should be questioned about whether she knows his Sha Nu and how she was able to use displacement magic, and also to find out her name. The next morning, the mystery woman woke up. Marie armed herself with her favourite whip, and threatening the girl with it, demanded that she answer who she was and how she used magic, and whether she knew Miss Shanna. The girl was wearing golden shackles that prevented her from conjuring. With a cold stare and a slight smile, she said she wasn't surprised Mary didn't recognize her. She called Marianne by name, making the maid wince. The girl introduces herself as Shana Castilla, and we recognize her in the body of our Li Shanga, who is now trapped in the body of a witch. Shana Castilla is the only one of the Count's children. After 4 miscarriages, the Countess was finally able to give birth to a child. Although she was born with magical powers, her body was very weak, and it wasn't because of her soul. Long ago, an old witch who hid her face with black magic stood at young Shanna's bedside and told her that the girl's body could not adapt to this strong soul. The magic that the Countess used to avoid another miscarriage etched the child's soul out of her body and sent it to another. This magic was forbidden, and because of it, a crack appeared in the dimensions. So from a world existing in a completely different era and parallel to their time, came the soul of another child. It turned out that the Countess's real child was spiritually in a completely different body. The Countess could not bear it and slapped the witch in the face. In hysterics, the mistress ordered the wicked witch to be burned immediately. Though the old woman said that there was a simple method to correct the mistake, she would not listen to her. The witch was immediately sent to the stake. The old woman, in an attempt to save herself, cried out that the Countess should just love the child, and then the soul would not have much difficulty adapting to the body. But the witch was not spared, and was consigned to the fire. Little Shanna watched the action from the window of her hacienda. The words from the witch's mouth were deeply imprinted on the young lady of Castile. The Countess was inconsolable. She didn't recognize Shanna as her daughter and said that an evil witch had stolen the soul of her real child. She sobbed and regretted that she had foolishly lost her child by believing the witch. The Count decided that Shanna was forbidden to go outside and that the servants must always follow her and keep an eye on her. Shanna became a beauty, always eating high-quality food and dressed in fine clothes, but never feeling the same love for herself. But one day she met Count Guard, her uncle, who had treated her so sweetly. She thought that since he was also her family, he would love her as if she were his own. Shanna no longer needed her parents, and she started a fire on the estate. However, Shanna, having become the daughter of Guard, remained a caged bird. The emperor ordered her new father to travel the mainland, and for a year the girl was left alone again. Ancient books and gems with all kinds of magic accidentally found in the basement became her only entertainment. Thanks to these things, she summoned a cute pet dog, Raphael, and a few more living toys as servants. But the witch was overcome by a terrible boredom. This world didn't need her magic. Her fate was sealed: to marry, to bear heirs, and to drink, eat, and be merry. She had even considered using magic to gain control of the emperor, but it was hardly necessary. The only thing she truly wanted was to leave everything behind and return to her world. So she searched for the spell in the book. The witch tried to guess what kind of world she was supposed to be born into. Shanna stared out the window, unable to imagine what she might see out there. The memory of the burned witch who had told the Countess to love her child terrified her. Her anger overcame her, and she smashed several pots with her magic and overturned several pieces of furniture. Her breathing was hitching again, and her strength was waning. Mary took care of her mistress, telling her not to be angry and to rest a little, or she would risk getting sick. But Shanna rudely ordered her to shut up and gather magic for her. The maid bowed her head obediently, and drawing her whip, headed away. Raphael watched Marie, unable to understand how a man who beat other people could be so frightened. This maid would never harm others on her own accord, but nevertheless, she will complete this task to prove her loyalty to her mistress. Raphael put his hand to his heart and suggested that Shanna find another way to collect magic. People kept their mouths shut about money for now, but sooner or later, rumours would spread beyond the castle. It was as if Shanna wasn't even listening to her butler, with a smile ordering him to go to the mountains to eat some people for her. Or better yet, just bite their necks. Raphael could not disobey and bowed obediently, and since it was his mistress's wish, he would do it. Shanna ordered the boring, dog-like creature out of her sight. She wanted to be alone. She was starting to get bored with the routine. The last book on ancient magic she'd found in the basement was on the table in front of her, and if she read it, she'd have nothing else to kill time with. But suddenly, in the pages of this book, she saw a spell that could turn her life upside down. it was a doorway to other worlds. When the moon was full, Shanna killed several animals and sprinkled their fresh blood on the green grass. A scarlet seal appeared at the place of sprinkling, opening a window to another world where our protagonist Li Sha-na appeared. So this is what the world Shanna was supposed to be born into looks like. It's full of unknown machinery and technology, noisy parties and strange clothes. This is her homeworld. Shanna observed Sha-na's daily life, envying her happiness. She even had the same name as the girl from the Castilla family. She was the one who had exchanged souls with her. Lying in her bed, Shanna pondered why that girl could be so happy, sad, free, and just whatever she wanted, and also why she was constantly surrounded by people who loved her. After all, it was all supposed to belong to Shanna. The witch's memories were wistful, but even sadder was what was happening in the castle. Marie dropped the whip to the floor in horror, crawling back against the wall, disbelieving the stranger's words. The maid could not think how she knew what only Miss Shanna knew, but the witch did not reiterate her name. She coldly reminded her that she had left her at her side only because she was useful for another use. The maid listened obediently to her mistress and trembled as she sat on her knees. So much time had been wasted. Although the appearance and voice of the mistress differed from the genuine one, but the behavior, speech, and character, the way she oppressed others, confident in her impunity and permissiveness. Shanna reminded Marie of how she'd helped her when she'd almost been sold in a dark alley. Marie bowed and assured her that she dared not forget such a favour. One was left to wonder then, who was the lady who had now gone west, and who was Princess Shanna, who had been by her side all this time. Marie covered her face with her hands, hiding her tears, and the wicked witch put her hands on the maid's shoulders, saying that she had been tricked, and that wicked witch had stolen her real body. Mariana kneels before Shanna Castilla again and tells her everything that has happened. This empire never accepted witches, but one powerful witch became empress. No one would have believed the story if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, but Shanna wasn't surprised at all, as if she had known about it for a long time. She listened quietly to Marie's story and then ordered her to get everything ready for her afternoon hobby. Marie turned on some music and brought mistress a glass of red-flavoured wine. Shanna sat in the armchair with her leg over her leg and enjoyed the drink. The golden fetters that prevented the mistress from witchcraft, she ordered to return to the owner and to summon Emperor Luther himself to her. Marie obeyed and ran to carry out the instructions of her mistress, whose plans were again unclear to her, for it was almost impossible that the empress was none other than the evil witch who had taken her body. But it was the mistress she was obliged to serve. The maid did not know what to do, and because of the tears in her eyes, she stumbled and fell on the carpet. She resolutely decided, holding back her pain and crying, that she would wait for her empress. A few days later, Raphael delivered Li Sha-nu to the palace. The only thing left to do was to cross the high wall, which was a trifle for a familiar. He told his mistress to hold on tight and jumped high and high. But his flight was completed by landing in sharp spikes. Rafe held onto his elbows and trembled. The whole palace was enveloped in those spikes. It seems that while they were away, the palace was taken over. The magic belonged to its mistress Shanna, who had already made her devious plans and intrigues. Raphael was unable to move. The spikes contained a paralyzing poison, but its effects should wear off in a few hours. Then Shanna decided to go alone. The familiar was against the idea, but the mistress put her fingers to his lips, saying that it was his mistress's order. She touched her forehead to Raphael's forehead, making him blush, and told him to rest, and when his body had recovered, to go to Castilla Manor. The next steps would depend on the situation. Either he would have to defend the count or ask for his help. Rafe exclaimed that Shanna liked him. She was definitely using magic on him, because other methods of influence don't have such an effect. And the girl, who was also uncomfortable, just asked Rafe to be honest. The familiar smiled and said he believed her and told her to come back as soon as possible. And Shanna decided that this Shanna wasn't the only one who could use magic. And now she would show her what true power was. With those words, she lit up the night sky with a bright purple light. Shanna realized that she needed to get back to the palace as soon as possible. And just why Shanna did it, we can only wonder. She was swimming in gold, had magic, but decided to switch bodies with her. And even after her final decision, she went back to the medieval world for some reason. The most important question was whether she could now get her body back and return to her native modern world. This was what Shana wanted most of all. Magic enveloped the palace, burning away the thorns that surrounded it on all sides. Shana laughed and watched her opponent in the mirror. Seeing this scene, she should have been frightened by the witch's magic, but somehow she still walks forward just as majestically. Shana realized that that girl was really interesting. So that was how Shana was able to bewitch and impress the noble emperor. The emperor, who had come at her call, lay in the same fetters in a coffin among the flowers, his arms crossed over his chest. Marie knelt before him, asking her mistress what she had done. Shana replied indifferently, giving him a chance to rest a bit. It was easy to hurt people, but it took a lot of effort to kill them. The witch reminded Marie of the dog she had. Her name was similar to the maid's name, Miley. Miss had loved that puppy very much, but no one had seen the pet since she had gone missing. Shana echoed that magic had a price. She seemed to be using the puppy as a sacrifice for her ritual. The witch watched the determined Sha Noi, eagerly awaiting her arrival at her place. In her opinion, they were not different at all, but for some reason, no matter what world this girl found herself in, she always found those who loved her. This annoyed Shana immensely. At this time, Shana was deftly overcoming all the obstacles that Shana put in her way. Her provocations were useless. No matter what Shana did, she didn't react, as if she knew the witch had returned. Shana, on the other hand, thought it was fortunate that Raphael had returned first. But it was as if Shana could predict all her actions, putting more and more of her poisonous plants in the way. And now the girl reached the door, completely overgrown with roots. It was wasteful to use magic on such trifles, but apparently energy would have to be sacrificed. The Duke of Ballard himself was hovering among the restrained, frightened guards, urging the empress to calm down. Shana walked up to the Duke, poking her finger on his forehead. Indeed, he was the one. He told him that a witch he hadn't seen before had stolen the emperor away, and if the empress would help him, he would tell her the details, putting his reputation on the line. Shana said with a smile that she didn't have time for that, and it would be much faster to just burn all the vines along with the people. The frightened guards exclaimed that they too knew the route and directed the girl to the right place. There were no casualties, and Shana released the two boys, ordering that after the Duke was released, the guards should gather all the families that support the Castilla clan to rescue the emperor together. She threatened the Duke that if he tried to cheat, his entire family would be destroyed by magic. He'd remember that for a long time. Meanwhile, Shana destroyed the door with her whip, barging loudly into the hall. Well, Shana recognized that the girl had handled it well, no matter where she was, always throwing herself into the attack. While the witch was in the modern world, she often watched her counterfeit. She could not understand why the girl got what she herself had never gotten: a caring family, a loving father, loyal servants, even the love of the emperor himself. Also, Shana didn't realize it, and neither did the emperor. But Luther always looks at the girl with devoted love in his eyes as she devours the cookies. And for all that, she dared to use her body. The witch bit her lip in fury and smashed the mirror in annoyance. The question of why she could what Shana Castilla herself could not is rhetorical to us. At this point, Marie turned to the emperor, saying that this was a chance to free him. Luther, now free to move, put his sword to the witch's throat, saying that Miss Castilla was behaving quite childishly. Luther condemned her, looking at her scornfully and saying that all she does is complain about her life. It is a truly pathetic sight. Shana tried to hug the emperor, justifying that she had just said a few words about herself, and His Majesty should be so rude. But Luther, without a moment's thought, roughly pushed the witch away. Shana then decided that now was the most appropriate time to report who the body she was in belonged to, namely, dear Emperor Sha Ne. She was angry that Luther didn't take her words seriously. She had not yet encountered any resistance to her actions, so she was angry that someone dared to make her angry. It meant that the emperor was fully aware of his actions and was ready to face the consequences. In the blink of an eye, thorny pink vines rushed toward him. At this time, Shana was yelling desperately. There was a huge staircase in front of her that she was so reluctant to climb. Her legs were absorbent cotton. Several times the girl regretted practicing wind magic so little. It was dangerous to try to use it now, for she risked miscalculating her strength and flying away from the castle, as well as wasting the energy needed for the final battle. Barely, she crawled to the last floor she needed, collapsing in front of the door. Well, she owed it to herself to help the Empire invent elevators before she died. The only thing left to deal with was the gate, but for her the matter had already been settled. The door was suddenly pierced by the vines encompassing the Emperor. Luther shouted to Shano to run. She was the witch's target, and she wouldn't be able to handle her alone. Rung shouted and withdrew higher and higher, and after all, Shana had only gotten up to his floor. In the hall, Shana had already taken revenge on her maid Marie, who had dared to betray her for some girl. The witch climbed on top of her and strangled her, wanting her dead. Shana pounced on Shana, knocking her to the ground and shouting for the witch not to use her body for evil. There was a fleeting idyll. Marie was so happy to see her mistress that she forgot for a second what was happening. Shana watched with anger, rubbing her sore cheek. Even in modern times, where she should have been born, she was not accepted by her family, believing that their girl had been replaced by someone else. The witch screamed at Shane, asking why everyone around her loved her no matter what, both when she was cursed and when she had nothing. Blindly not noticing the differences between them, the witch yelled furiously that people like Shana should disappear from the face of the earth. With a stone face, not wanting to clarify anything, Shana suggested that she would rather start the battle. After all, with such shallow creatures, matters could only be solved this way. The battle between the witches began. The palace burned to the ground that day, and although the incident was recorded in textbooks as one of the loudest and most terrible, only the witnesses knew if it was really a battle between witches. While Count Castilla and Raphael were busy rescuing everyone in the palace, a real battle was going on between the women. The girls, exhausted of their energy, clung to each other's hair, threatening to tear it out. A verbal altercation ensued, in which each insulted her opponent. One said that baldness was in fashion, and she had no taste at all. The other sought to turn the witch into a nun. The situation was rather chaotic. The girls fought like crazy until the sun went down. It was unclear who had won. Suddenly, a cry was heard from the freed, wounded Emperor Luther, rushing to his beloved. A panting Shana stood in front of the defeated Shana Castilla. She still managed to pull her hair out, and stood there, holding the shreds in her hands in frustration. The witch looked ridiculous now, her bald head glistening from the rays of the setting sun. Perhaps Shana had relied on magic too much. Shana and her sister had been the storm of the alley since elementary school, beating children with a stick. The battle was over, and the Empress headed away. On her first steps, she stumbled and twisted her foot a little, falling into the arms of the worried Emperor. She looked at her husband's wounded face with a smile, saying that she wanted to save him, but didn't expect him to get out on his own. And Luther also wanted to save his wife, which Shana was very grateful for. The girl simply couldn't keep her balance, for her body had exhausted all her magical powers. Luther lifted Shanu in his arms, asking how she felt. Everything was fine, but Rune suggested waiting for Count Castilla. Shana insisted on a quick rest, so the pair headed away, leaving the bald witch unconscious. After the incident, the injured emperor practiced hard, and Shana returned to Count Castilla's estate, with the familiar fragrant garden of red roses, under the pretext of recovery. Luther was carefully treating Shana's wounds with a painful medicine, and she gritted her teeth against the burning. He could have left it to Marie, for he had plenty of work to do, but Rune insisted that he would take care of his empress himself. A servant entered the room, bringing the emperor's to-do list for tomorrow, as well as news of the meeting that was about to begin. The girl glanced at her husband. Luther could familiarize himself with all the documents here, but what he would do if the treacherous Duke Ballard decided to take the throne should be decided in advance. Luther grinned, darting around guessing which witch had destroyed his throne room. Shana awkwardly replied that she didn't remember which one it was. Of course, the destruction had been the work of the real Shana, but that information the girl had forgotten without a trace. Rune informed the Empress that Shana Castilla had awakened today. The girl was eager to see her at once, hoping that she was ready to have a serious talk with her. Raphael worriedly asked if it would be better to postpone the visit to his mistress for a week, but Shana saw no difference in seeing her today, or in a few days. The familiar was definitely worried about his beloved mistress, and he was still feeling guilty for betraying his mistress. Shana, reassuring the faithful dog, took his hand and told him that he had done what he had to do, and the one who had betrayed first was Shana Castilla. Besides, his mistress is now Miss Li Shana. Rafe smiled after listening to the warm words and said he would wait for her safe return, calling the girl his mistress, gradually breaking the bond with the real Shana. Shana walked into the hall where Shana sat in a golden cage, just like the girl herself had once been. The witch had been waiting for her and knew that she was coming to see her. Shana Castilla looked pathetic, a simple dress and a black hat hiding a bald spot. But that didn't diminish the witch's confidence. She already knew why Shana had come to see her. Naturally, the girl wanted to return to her world, but she flatly refused to do so until her hair grew back. But she needed a way back. Shana grinned and stipulated that it was now Shana's responsibility to see to her comfort and safety. If she wanted things to go back to normal, she shouldn't tell the Count about the shower change. This time her new father's love nourishes body and soul, so it wasn't as important for her to return to modernity. Shana noted with indifference that she hadn't thought the witch would be so calm. She had expected a real tantrum. The witch explained that she suspected she was losing, returning to the boring world. Shana asked about her family, for Shana must have gotten to them when she was displaced. The witch told her not to worry. Under the pretext of going on vacation with her friends, she had disappeared, so they wouldn't be looking for her anytime soon. The deal, in Shana's opinion, was a good one, and now the girl should return her body as soon as possible. After that, she would teach her magic, thanks to which she would be able to get back to her world. Putting her hand to her side, Shana was confident of her superiority, so she demanded she get someone to serve her before she made any more demands. Shana ordered the servants to come in and prepare a festive dinner, but the beautiful and appetizing table was not meant for the witch. The witch was dumbfounded, for right in front of her nose, her rival was mockingly devouring delicious dishes. Shana calmly remarked that the caged lady was completely unaware of who had the last word in such a case. Since the witch had told her family that Shana was traveling, she must know how much she missed her native home food. Kimchi that is never greasy, freshly cooked rice, the divine flavor of instant noodles. But the out-of-this-world turkey was so magnificent that the empress was ready to forget the taste of her native food. Miss Castilla, who had always settled for sumptuous meals, must know what she meant. Shana sank into the bars with trembling hands, realizing that her losses were not over. Shana teased the hungry witch, marveling at the taste of the chicken, and then asked for freshly cooked fish or lobster to be served to her. The servant respectfully accepted the order. Shana turned away in despair, saying how unscrupulous Shana was, because she had given her vegetable soup that only commoners eat. But now Shana realized that the empress had the final say on her food, so she was the one who set the conditions. Shana asked the witch to tell everything she knows before getting angry. Shana took her eyes aside, saying how reckless the girl was being. There was a reason Raphael said she was acting like a bison. Shana, on the other hand, with annoyance, but with the same friendly smile, threatened the witch with porridge for dinner. Shana gave up and decided to tell everything. She told me that there are only two kinds of magic in the world. The first is called time and space magic. It requires a large number of moonstones to form an altar, whether for coming or going to another world. The problem was that there were no moonstones left in modern times, and the altars of this world had been exhausted by Shana herself. However, thanks to the witch's intimate knowledge of ancient books and the help of a demon, she will be able to restore this moonstone. To do so, she must draw certain patterns on the stones and fill them with magic. The main part of the spell takes place in the second stage. Naturally, this magic has its own price. Shana was surprised that one could use something other than feeding on other people's suffering. Shana replied coldly that it would take people who loved her and were willing to sacrifice themselves. They would be the ones to pay the price. A girl's choice must be made carefully. Not everyone would be willing to give up their life for another. Shana walked out and slammed the door in anger. She ran outside to catch her breath. She simply couldn't afford to ask someone to die for her. That was crazy. No matter how much she wanted to go home, Shana knew for sure that she wouldn't use this method. She ran to the fountain and placed her hands on it, looking at her crying reflection in the clear water. Hearing Shana's words, Shangar's heart made its choice in an instant. The one who loved her and would sacrifice everything for her was always there. Shana straightened up and called to her faithful servant Raphael, who had emerged from the water of the fountain. Before Shana went to see Raphael, Marie came to see her mistress. Shana resented her for eavesdropping on other people's conversations like a mouse. First she betrayed her, and now she's standing in front of her. A really clueless girl. Marie guessed that the lady had made Mila, her favourite dog, a sacrifice for the ritual. The witch said that in the end, it was the dog that was most dear to her. But Marie contradicted her, saying that wasn't true. Raphael and the Count could have been victimized by the young lady as well. As long as she trusted them and asked for their help, they would not refuse her. In that case, Madame simply shouldn't have envied the world where the Empress came from. Shana didn't understand what she was getting at and ordered her to cut to the chase. Marianne said that the lady apparently didn't know what she wanted and was just wandering aimlessly through the world. The lady had everything she could have wished for, however. Seeing her willingly leave everything behind put her in a sad state of mind. Because even though Shana was no longer her mistress, she sincerely wished that the witch hadn't become even more miserable because the lady who had saved her was a true angel. Those were Marie's last words. She bowed and thanked Shana, then started to leave the room. The witch shouted at her to stop her taunting and chased her away, calling her a traitor. Shana added that the Empress she now served would also need a sacrifice to return to her world, so she was no different from the real Shana in this situation. The door slammed shut, leaving all of Shana's questions, looking tearfully at her maid, no longer listening to her threats, in her wake, unanswered. Summoned by the fountain, Raphael was ready to fulfill any request of his mistress. It was very difficult and dangerous, but the familiar assured him that even if Shana was very strong, he should not forget that the only people who could defeat him were her and that emperor he disliked. Shana told her servant everything, frightening him. He was at a loss to guess what his mistress would do, kill the emperor at last, or defeat the real Shana, or perhaps still summon the power of the dragon. Shana laughed as she listened to these ridiculous thoughts. She looked at her faithful wolf with a sad smile and said only that Shana's head looked pathetic, so she wanted to help her grow her hair back. Raphael reassured Shanu, saying that he would find a better way to bring her back. He also promised to help with anything she wanted, even if he didn't want her to return to her homeworld. Shana became convinced that her idea was stupid. She couldn't ask that this wonderful demon could give his life for her. She lifted herself up on her toes and kissed Raphael gently in gratitude. In the end, Shana didn't ask anyone, for she knew that both Marie, Raphael, and the Count would honor her request. A few days later, Shana, eating vegetable soup, informed Shanae that it was worth dealing with the matter as soon as possible, preferably before the hair grew back. Time flows in both worlds, so Shanae's family might have questions. The girl felt sadder and sadder with each one. She couldn't make a choice. On a moonlit night, she sat at a table full of sweets and felt like she couldn't breathe, clutching the tablecloth. The glass shattered from the tension of the tablecloth, falling and spilling the scarlet drink over the white cloth, and the girl pined and sobbed for her family, deliriously trying to reach her parents. Under the influence of the wine, Shana decided to tell everything to Rung. He knew that his wife wanted to be alone, so he didn't bother her these days, but thinking that Shana couldn't handle things alone, he came to comfort her. The girl looked at Luther through her tears, holding herself back from bursting into tears of despair. She didn't care if he sent her to prison or not. One thing she knew for sure was that Rune wouldn't give his life for her. He must live for this world. To Shangar's surprise, Luther held her tightly against him, comforting her. He could feel how bitter and hurt she was right now. That was what the girl needed most right now. After a while, when Shana calmed down, Luther told her to rebuild the moon altar with her familiar today, and he himself was willing to be her sacrifice. The girl flared up and grabbed the emperor's cheeks, condemning him for the stupidity he had just given out. But the boy did not finish his sentence. He had a great plan on how not to sacrifice any of the girl's loved ones. After listening to Shana, he realized that the amount of blood needed for the ritual was lethal, but the problem could be solved by using the blood of several people. It was a brilliant idea, because it really wasn't about the fact that a loving person must necessarily die. Shana clapped her hands in delight. She thanked Rune and offered to do something for him as a thank you. The boy had a question that had been bothering him all along. He asked her to tell him what Shani's answer would be if he wanted her to remember it forever. Rune took the girl's hand and kissed it gently. Shana was embarrassed, waiting for the sentence to continue, and Luther, looking at his beloved with embarrassment, said that he was eager to give her his first time. We can't even guess at once which first time Luther was talking about. The girl asked what the first time was, to which the emperor replied confidently that he wanted to give her all of himself. Like what he was going to do next. Rung leaned toward Shanae, about to kiss her, but he opened his eyes and saw his lover's hands shaking with tension. He pulled away, noting that he wanted to grow with her. So if she didn't want to now, he would be patient. Shana countered that that wasn't true at all, but the only way she could explain that it had just happened to her was that she was definitely sick. As she panicked, flitting between decisions about the best course of action, Luther reached for her lips again. Shana immediately slammed her palms over the guy's mouth, clarifying if Rune meant first-time kissing. The boy nodded, reminding her that Shana was his first woman. Now the girl felt it her duty to tease him. She declared that she only kissed experienced men, but if the emperor could tie a cherry stem in a bow with his tongue, she would consider it. Luther, not thinking long, fulfilled her wish, saying that the beautiful emperor is definitely a born genius. Besides, he is much more confident than Shana's pet, so there is nothing to worry about. The girl blushed with embarrassment. Luther had seen everything, and even after that he longed to kiss her. Rune calmly stated that whoever she likes, he will still love her. He is greedy and wants her to be only his lady. But as time went on, Rune realized that the more jealous he became, the more rapidly the girl he loved was drifting away from him, so he decided to give it up. Luther reached for the girl, holding her cheek with the palm of his hand, and speaking of his hope that Shana would remember this kiss forever. The girl gasped with worry that she would never have such beautiful moments in her life again. She felt very happy. Her emperor is truly a genius. Shana was so embarrassed that she told Luther of her desire to be alone tonight. The girl lay on the bed in a star pose, blushing at every memory left in this chaotic day. She had planned to cry at first, and then cheer up and have a moonlight tea party with the palace people, but the mood was completely different now. She felt devastated that she had kissed two guys at once. She wanted to fall through the ground. However, this was the last time. But the girl absolutely did not want to end her journey. Sitting down on the bed, she didn't understand her feelings and tried to convince herself that she should go back home, to a place where she would be happy. She feels no joy at all. Where the girl who used to sob at night, longing for her family and home, and why her feelings have changed so much, remains a mystery to her tormented soul. Shana got out of bed and poured herself some delicious tea. There were still a few days left to make a decision. Already tomorrow she would start building the moonstone altar with Raphael and spend a good time with the others. And then she would ask for their help. The plan was marvelous, but only the tears rolling down her cheeks proved otherwise. That night, Shana had a dream where she was back in the modern world and living in her body. After her part-time job, she came home and spent the day with her family. The girl was happy, but realized that even after many years she would miss the people of this world. She seemed to be too attached to this place. Shanu would surely be concerned with questions about their lives, hassles with the troubled ducal family. When she returned, she beat Rune badly, but it didn't seem like it was enough. Tears were coming out on their own. In the dream, she didn't understand why she wanted to return to the world of the past, but she cried and said goodbye to her family, apologizing to them. In the morning, the caged Shana Castilla howled, saying that she didn't need the count or the demon or the maid. Nothing of this world mattered to her anymore. She begged to be brought back to the modern world and given another chance so that she could finally start to cherish her cell phone, fast connection, and instant noodles. Shana appeared suddenly, questioning whether the words that had just come off the witch's lips were sincere. Shana was so saddened that she didn't immediately notice the empress, thinking she was a ghost. Wow, the witch didn't even use rude words in her speech. But if her intentions are pure, Shana swore in her grandfather's name that before Shana's hair grows back, she will teach her to be a modern man. Li Shana's hometown is in a country where Oriental etiquette is developed and Confucian teachings are entrenched. She used to be uncomfortable with it, but gradually reconsidering her views, she made up her mind. Shana asked Shanna to swear her sincerity and then began to train her. Shana eventually came to like ceramic items, especially the process of making them. She also quickly and effectively taught the witch the moral principles of the modern world. Although Shanna always complained, she worked hard for their common goal. The motivation was food. For good grades, she got porridge, and for poor grades, the witch would cook it herself. But as long as Shanna was given proper food, she was willing to do anything, and her train of thought was to Shana's liking. The empress also reiterated with a smile that before a witch could warp time and space, she must learn to take care of the people around her. It was her sister's final advice. The lessons for the day were over. Shana had no idea that teaching and educating people was so hard. The next thing to be prepared was the altar. Raphael, along with Shah Noi, standing still with their hearts still close together, created new moonstones. The altar came out amazing, and there were only a few more of the same stones left to complete it. The familiar was pleased with his beloved mistress's decision, but still worried if she would regret her choice. She ignored the question, noticing that Raphael had stopped wearing his eye patch. It turned out that he wore it on Shanna's orders, to hide his demonic nature. Shanna was surprised, for she had always thought that one just wanted to seem cool. The familiar's eyes were indeed noticeably different, and if the mistress didn't like it, he could put the blindfold back on. The girl waved her hands, saying there was no need for that. On the contrary, she thought it was a feature that only beautified him, and if he wanted it, she would give him an improved cooling bandage. Raphael was flattered, remembering the fire handcuffs his mistress had also given him. The girl flared up, interjecting to ask what kind of fire we were talking about, to which the familiar immediately apologized. After a while, everything was ready for departure. The decisive day had arrived. Shana put on a light polka-dot farewell dress and hat to escort her sister on her long journey. She made the decision to stay in this world, to live in Shana Castilla's body of her own free will. And the false Li Shana will return to the modern world and continue her life. Shanna herself said that it was meant to be that way from the beginning. She added that everyone had to be born into a world that suited him. She was insane in the old world, so she was leaving it without regret. Shanna countered that this time it was their own choice. She wished Shanna, after she knew love, to allow her soul to settle into her body. After all, not only should those around her love her, but she should do so in return. Shanna felt awkward, but the witch had really worked hard to earn her family's love. Subconsciously, she already loved them. So it turns out that true love is always mutual. Shanna asked if Shanna misses her family in her heart. She only replied that she missed her cute and fat cat Bread. The answer was clearly positive. Shanna was a little jealous, but she was happy. She wished her a happy life after her return and told her to use the mirror to see her. The girls chorally insisted that they weren't doing anything wrong by using each other's bodies, and then laughed at what was already so obvious.
It was time to say goodbye. A scarlet pillar of light struck the sky, and Shanna disappeared into the moonlit altar. Shanna was both sad and happy. She would not regret her choice, only miss her family sometimes. But this world had conquered her to her very heart. With tears, the girl watched the fading light in the sky.
Luther appeared behind them, hugging the girl to comfort her. Raphael joined him, and then Marianne. Shanna was grateful to her new favourite family. After all this happened, Shanna became a full-fledged empress. In addition, a few years later, with the blessing of the goddess, the emperor and empress became the owners of equal rights. But naturally, even though the law says so, the emperor will always have more power. The ducal Ballard family seized the opportunity and fled. Then they learned that the previous queen, Rune's biological mother, had ascended to the throne. She had been involved in various conflicts between factions and then killed. For this reason, Shanna and Rune tried their best, and now have equal rights and opportunities, to this day working together for the development of the common empire. Therefore, day in and day out, they are swamped with work. Luther asked Shanu to leave work and go to rest, so that he could deal with the rest, because she was working for the third day without rest. But the girl persisted, wanting to finish all the documents. She had a little bit left to finish. In response, She told Rune to go rest first, then get ready for the night's work with her. The girl didn't even take her eyes off the papers. The emperor had no power to convince her. We'd have to join forces with the enemy. Luther called out to Raphael, who immediately appeared on the doorstep, flanked by two laughing, sweet girls, and complaining that their powers outnumbered his demonic ones. Shana spoke to her daughters. They had fun all day, riding a tired heirloom, running around on the palace roof and learning magic. Lana and Luna decided to show their mum their abilities and started flying around the room using wind magic. Their powers developed and grew at a tremendous rate, and if the parents had magic abilities, they were definitely passed on to their offspring. The girl couldn't see who they looked more like, to which the boys replied that it was her. Shana only looked embarrassed in response. Raphael added that he hadn't expected the magic dragon's power to be passed on to both of them. Luther explained that the reason for that was because the witch had the ability to shatter the lizard's power. And for that matter, Shana made the decision to take on the task of educating her daughters. But it seemed, as Ron carefully noticed, that the empress was very tired and was about to collapse on the floor. Rune picked up his wife, saving her from falling. He gave her permission to return home, and he would take over all palace affairs for the duration of her departure. The girl was madly glad, though she did not want to leave her Luther alone with the tedious work. The only thing left to figure out was who to leave the rambunctious children to. The choice, of course, fell on the drowned Raphael, who had no right to refuse. Shana took a carriage to Garda Manor. She thought on the way that she would be sure to give Raphael a break from looking after the children for a few days after she returned. She arrived at the home of the already Duke of Castile. After Charnoy and Luther suppressed the influence of the ducal family of Ballard, the Count of Garda's influence increased greatly, and he became the right hand of the empire. The Count welcomed his daughter with open arms. He saw that she was feeling well and said that he had downloaded it. The Count himself, as always, looked healthy and young. Gard laughed. Shana hadn't just come to rest, but to familiarize him with the plan she had been working on before. It was a plan to rebuild the witch's tower. It was a very ancient structure, from the time when ordinary people lived in peace with witches. In this tower, almost like in educational institutions, magical theory and practice were taught, and proper philosophy was developed. Shana planned to become the mistress of this tower and use it for development, mainly so that it would play positively for Lana and Luna. The Count was pleased with this bright thought. He told Shana only to be careful, and if he needed his help, he was always ready to assist. Shana was truly happy. This non-perfect life had its ups and downs. Sometimes she would watch her family through the mirror and feel strange, but despite that, she was perfectly happy. There are many things she needs to do and wants to create, but still, she has never once regretted the choice she made many years ago. The second season of the Manhwa begins with us being reminded of the origins of Shana Castilla, a girl who had such a noble name but didn't live up to it. But now that name no longer belonged to her. She was currently living like her copy and sister Li Shana in the modern world, having traded her native medieval world, full of magic and miracles, for it. The girl wandered down the street, happy about the paycheck that was about to arrive. How amazing it is that you can get money directly to your phone. Before, Shana couldn't have imagined that one day she would have such an independent life. She had always been taken care of by others, and she had thought that without magic, she would be incapable of anything. At the slightest strain, she had to suffer from fever and lie in bed for days. Now she was living the city life in peace. There was a scream from behind. The unknown girl was clutching at the other girl's hair, calling her a witch and accusing her of stealing her boyfriend. Two teenage girls stood on the other side, giggling and looking at their gadgets. Shana was annoyed by this noise, which seemed quite natural for a big city. With a snap of her fingers, Shana disabled one of the girls' devices, infuriating her. After all, she had only purchased the technique yesterday, and it was already refusing to work. On top of that, her hair crumbled in a flash. Shana watched the revenge with a smile. Modern hair products can't compare to the powers from the other world, so for the prevention of bad behavior, let her suffer without her beautiful strands. As the witch went on, she came across a man proving to the old woman that if she wanted to trade, she would have to open a stall here and pay for it. But the old woman had only sold one pot today, and she couldn't afford to keep a store. Then Shana, with the same snap of her fingers, stripped the stingy man of his clothes in a flash. There were shouts of condemnation all around, and the girl did not hesitate to report a naked man disturbing the public order in the city in broad daylight. After dealing with all the irritants, Shanna noticed that her magical power was gradually running out. If she continued to live in this world, she would one day become an ordinary person. At first she was worried about it, but then she began to remember the lessons Li Shana had taught her. She told the witch that in the modern world there was nothing stronger than the internet. It was also worth learning the skill of accumulating money, because in the modern world it is something like magic, because all the power is concentrated in them. After going through the suffering lectures, Shanna became a true resident of Korea. To the final question about what Korean people value most, she answered firmly and decisively with love. She also added about rice and hot soup, which can be used to convey her feelings to someone else. That day, she passed the exam with flying colours, and as a reward, she was not given porridge but Korean hot rice soup for dinner. Shanna remembered those days as the hardest, but thanks to these sufferings, she was able to adapt easily to modern realities. Suddenly, Shanna heard some noises and ran to help. It turned out that the same girl who had lost her hair was trying to take the phone away from her friend. Shanna called out to the girl as Xiao Qi and asked what she was doing here. The insolent girl tried to chase her away, and she knew her friend's name well. Shanna insisted that the girl's name is Xiao Qi and she is her cousin. She said she worked not far from here. The company was starting to get a little annoying, so she was thinking about winning the lottery. And luckily, her hobby consists of casting curses. The girl was horrified and left her friend alone, running away, shouting apologies and promises not to come near her again. Shanna called out to the girl and told her that even though she had helped her today, she should learn to defend herself instead of waiting for someone else to help her. Practice in jujitsu or sorcery would be useful, better than nothing. In the evening, Shanna called her sister from the other world. She told her that she was becoming like her thanks to her new knowledge and skills. Shanna also asked how she was doing and what she was doing now. Shanna replied with a smile that she was boating with her emperor. Shanna wished her family good luck and asked them to remember to call her. She seemed to be doing well, so there was no need to worry anymore. Luther told his empress that if she missed her world so much, let her call her herself too, instead of waiting constantly for her call. Shanna grumpily waved away, saying that she was fine and happy. The witch's tower was almost finished, and she could finally rest. Luther smilingly told her not to let herself do even small things on her well-deserved day off. He also made her promise to let go of the past and to tell him if she needed anything. The girl promised to do her best. Shanna asked why Rung chose such a small boat, since it must be hard to steer. The boy jokingly asked if she didn't want to be closer to him. Shanna did not understand what her husband was leaning towards. Then he reminded her of the very night when he had just finished his business and his beloved had started the conjugal act herself. The girl flushed and went into denial, claiming that it was Luther who had seduced her by coming completely wet out of the shower straight to her. Something was amiss on both sides that night, but Shanna was so embarrassed that she ended that conversation. Several years have passed since the day she decided to stay in this world. Many things have happened. She has become an empress, built a tower of witches, and found eternal love. The young people were already reaching for each other to give each other a tender kiss, when suddenly Raphael emerged from the water, frightening the couple to such an extent that they collapsed into the water. The familiar said it was time for the lady to return to the palace sooner rather than later, and to Rune's attempts to object with the remaining time he had left, he whispered that there was no way he was going to let them have a third child. Shanna still remembered her modern world and sometimes missed her family, but now her home was a palace, and they celebrate holidays too in their own way. The cute daughters presented their mum with surprise gifts and scarlet roses. It was a real happiness for Shah Nha. Today was her birthday, and the closest people came to congratulate her. Count Castilla, Raphael, and of course, her beloved husband Luther. The aristocrats shouted congratulations to the Tang Empire's only moon, wishing her all blessings and prosperity. Within these walls were so many people she loves and who love her, even the wandless Marcel of the Ballard family, who had secretly attended the celebration. Shanna believed that her happiness would last forever, and all the dear and dear ones would always be there for her. The rose-coloured glasses covered her eyes so much that she did not notice the changes taking place around her. It was pain slowly overpowering her familiar. It was hard for him to accept his mistress's choice, but he tried not to show her his feelings, looking at her with a soft smile. Raphael was alone with a bottle of liquor that evening, and as he gulped it down, he couldn't find a single reason why Shana had chosen the emperor. Perhaps it was his status, or maybe it was his intelligence and beauty. Then the servant wondered if it was the dexterity of his tongue that could tie a knot in a cherry stem. Raphael tried it, thinking it was easy, but it was not what it seemed. A familiar voice suddenly called out to Raphael, bringing him back to reality. It seemed to be his mistress. But in the place where Raphael expected to see his mistress, there stood a man who looked uncannily like himself. He was Raphael's brother, named Lalofu. The demon grinned mockingly, realizing that his voice had been confused with that of Rafe's beloved mistress. Then he decided to say something else that would put doubt in the wolf's heart. He spoke as if in Shana's voice, saying that Raphael was the most loyal of their familiars, that he was almost like a lover to her, and that she had married Luther only because of his dragon power. Raphael ordered his brother to stop this performance and be silent, turning into a wolf and lunging at him. The enraged dog glared at his brother, growling, but he lay on the green grass as if nothing had happened. Lalofu began to insinuate to Raphael that he had been used and abandoned. Raphael resisted, denying everything that had been said. Indeed, he had not yet been abandoned and was still being used, his brother thought, looking at him with his narrow and cunning eyes. Raphael said that he was living for Shana from now on. He had chosen this way, and now he would always be by her side, even if he had to die of unrequited love every day. Raphael released his brother and returned to his human form, asking why he had come back, since his brother hated the world so much. He had said that being a surname was a disgrace for a demon. Lalofu, shaking off the sand, stated that his opinion had changed. Only by helping the witch could the familiars stay on this earth with their magical power. Of course, he had said earlier that with Raphael's power and his strength, it was a mistake to serve some weak man. But now he admitted that he would be fine as a familiar. Except that Lalofu claimed he definitely wouldn't fall in love and become someone's plaything. Then the brother offered a deal. Apparently, Lalofu's eyes were different colours, which meant that someone was unlucky enough to become his master. But the demon wouldn't reveal his cards, leaving the identity of his witch a secret. Raphael was delighted with the news that there were still witches on earth who could summon a familiar. If only they could come to the witch's tower, Shana would be happy. But just the realization that came to him in the moment horrified him. Lalofu grinned menacingly and said, disappearing into the black mist, that one day Raphael would realize it for himself. The familiar returned to his mistress to deliver some important news. He told her what had happened, suspecting that one of the princesses might have signed a contract with his brother. Shana had said that Lana and Luna were still children, so they weren't likely to have access to such opportunities, unless they were geniuses. Shana smiled smugly, realizing that her daughters were just like her. Raphael was panic-stricken, begging to hear him out. He was quite unlike his brother, who was exactly equal to the true devil. His cunning justified all human conceptions of demons, and even other creatures avoid this insidious serpent, for he loves to enjoy the suffering of others. Shana waved the feather playfully, thinking that no one enjoyed it more than she did. Naturally, it was just a joke to try to settle the situation, but the case was really bad. Lalofu might be useful to his master, but he wouldn't leave his life to him. Shana said that the princesses were already asleep, so she would ask them about it in the morning. In the meantime, Raphael shouldn't wear himself out with this and find a way to break the contract, because that's what he knows best. Shana lay playfully on the couch, still waving the feather in different directions. Raphael thanked Shana for believing him, and apologized for letting things get them involved with his devilish brother. Shana sent Raphael off with a smile to deal with the contract. But as soon as the door slammed shut, her face changed to cold and hateful, unable to find an answer to how that cruel demon had dared to do such a thing. The dragon's power and the witch's magic were powers that both princesses possessed equally from birth. But they grow, and as time went on, they began to differ in their powers. At one of the festivities, Lana enthusiastically held an expensive carved blade in her hands, drawing attention to herself. Then she raised her knife hand upward, and immediately the blade lit up with a bright flame. Except that the piece itself was completely ruined, turning to ashes and bringing misery to the giver, the Duke of Ballard himself. The fire didn't hurt Lana at all. In the evenings, she often climbed into the fireplace and lounged among the flames, saying she was playing baked eggs. Unlike Princess Lana, Luna was very intelligent, but had no predisposition for elemental or natural magic at all. But her unique ability was in socializing. She would often stroll through the courtyard and chat with a mouse who had stolen macaroons from the sweet table. The animal told her she was a hamster, squeaking sweetly, and then received a gift from the Princess of Grains more suited to her diet. Raphael racked his brain, wondering which princess might have signed a contract with his hated brother. Speaking of which, there was some nuance. The girls asked excitedly if it was really possible to summon a demon and talk to it. They had no idea how to do it, much less a contract. Raphael didn't hear a clear answer from his brother, but his reaction was too suspicious. The butler might have been mistaken, but he shouldn't jump to conclusions. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was the emperor coming to fetch his empress. They were already late, so they had to hurry. Shanna left Rafe to look after the princesses again, and went on her way with Luther. Raphael assured Shanna that he would protect the princesses in any case, looking lovingly at his lovely mistress in his wake. There are many ancient books on magic in the Castilla family mansion. Perhaps some information could be found there. Shanna's thoughts were interrupted by Rune's voice. He could see that she wasn't telling him the truth, but he trusted her and knew that there was probably a reason for it, so he didn't want to question her. He realized it quickly. His insight was worthy of his position. Luther has a right to know everything about his children, but until the information is missing, there's no point in scaring him before his time. After all, this news could affect his work, so it's not worth it. However, Luther warned Shanna to be careful with her dog. He thought it was dangerous for her to stay close to him, because he had never been able to let go of his feelings for her. It was dangerous to rely heavily on him in this situation. Rune hoped that Shanna would understand, and said that it was time to part ways with the surname. Raphael stayed in the palace and tucked the princesses into soft beds at night. His brother reappeared at the window, catching him at his babysitting job. Raphael didn't appreciate his joke, and told Lalof to go back to the demon world. But the demon came back to save his little brother. It hurt him to see him serving the witch like a real dog. Raphael flared up. He was amused to hear such a thing from someone who had been eager to spoil everything he owned since he was a child. Lalofu continued to scoff, saying that even after his confession he had been rejected. Raphael waited a long time to answer his brother's question about what his favourite witch had said to him, but admitted that he hadn't spoken to her about it, completely shattering Lalofu's expectations of what he had heard. Raphael only wanted Shanna to be happy, and he didn't care about his happiness at all. It was for that reason that he spared that damned emperor. A familiar would have ruined his relationship with his mistress. With anger in his eyes, Raphael blurted out that he would rather get rid of his brother than do any of the things he had said. The vase of water at the window cracked, and an icy spike of water shot out of it, straight at Lalof's neck. But the demon calmly asked what if he guaranteed not to violate Raphael's terms, and would fulfill his wish without hurting anyone. Raphael was interested. In the morning, the long-awaited meeting of father and daughter, embraced so warmly after a long separation, took place at the Count's mansion. At the table with tea and treats, they discussed the latest news. The Count was glad to see his family, for they had not visited him for a long time. It was a relief to him that they looked well. Marie had gone to town in the morning on business, unaware of her mistress's return, so she didn't welcome them with open arms. But the Count had already sent for her, so she was probably on her way home. Shanna decided to go up to her room and asked him to call her when Marie returned. As soon as the door closed, Duke Castilla said confidently that Shanna was hiding something from them. Rune, sipping his tea, noticed this confidence in his words. The Duke knew very well that since they had come here, something was definitely bothering them. And then Luther answered that he trusted his wife, but not her surname. He'd assumed he'd let her go and leave on his own, but lately he'd been trying to spend more time with Shanna. Rune had a limit to his patience too, and such actions pissed him off. There was a heavy silence. It was more complicated than expected. But suddenly Luther said that he knew that Duke Guard had been through something similar, which took him by surprise. There had to be a reason why he had given up so easily. Then Guard replied firmly, clenching his fist and looking directly at the jealous emperor, that he only wanted her happiness. That was why he had let her go. Shanna went through the entire library in her room, searching for the right book that talked about breaking contracts. It couldn't be that it didn't exist at all, because the practice was very common. The girl had to dig through her entire library and sincerely pray that all her searches were provoked by excessive worry for her daughters. But for reassurance, it was still worth it to find information about the termination of the contract with the demon her children might have made. Finally, the right book fell into her hands. Running her eyes over the ancient pages, Shanna found the chapter she was looking for. But it was only about summoning demons and nothing about exorcising them. Perhaps there was one more book missing from the library's shelves. It was a real mockery, because she had spent so much time searching and hadn't made any progress. The witch was so angry that she let off steam by summoning lightning in the middle of a clear day with her powerful spells. At this moment, Marie, her maid, was finally arriving at the mansion, rushing with all her legs to the entrance. The lightning bolt summoned by the witch gave her a sign that her mistress had been waiting for her inside for some time now. And then Marianne ran into the manor, hurried up to her mistress's chambers and burst into her room, hugging Shanna, delighted at her arrival. We are reminded that Marianne had always been Shanna's right hand. Before the ascension of her mistress, who became empress, to the throne, the maid was always at her side, but was now considered a member of the aristocracy. Marie cried and wiped the tears pouring from her eyes, talking about how long it had been since she had seen her mistress. A year, 3 years, or maybe as long as 5 years. But it turned out, as Shanna pointed out, that they hadn't seen each other for only 3 weeks. But for the maid, it wasn't just 3 weeks. It was almost a month. They had never been apart for any length of time, except for the time Shanna had travelled west. And of course, the moments of solitude with the emperor. Marie exclaimed that she was going to die an old maid. She needed a mate. She had once written to her mistress about a gentleman who had won her heart, but there had been no new news since. Well, it turned out that he was a real monster of the human race. He'd treated her well, which was why Marie had chosen him. But as soon as she learned that he had 7 lovers besides her, she realized she had to end this Santa Barbara immediately. That guy offered to be special to her, but it made Marianne so angry that she threw coffee in his face and left. Even though it was stupid, because their relationship hadn't lasted long, she didn't regret it or hold a grudge against him. It was all fate's will, and Marie had long ago put him out of her mind, so as not to worry about nothing. And we notice how the gardener Sean, who knows us, is watching the fascinating conversation through the window, looking at Marie. The maid decided to change the subject by asking her mistress what had happened. She assumed that Shanna would be spending her vacation with the emperor, but decided to visit them. Shanna set down her cup of tea and warned that Marie might be frightened if she knew the reason. The maid assured her that it was not so, and with a smile began to listen to her miss's story. As she told it, her face lost its joy, and at the end she could not believe her ears at all. It was simply impossible not to be frightened when she heard that one of the young princesses might have made a bargain with the devil. If something suddenly went wrong, the empire would be turned upside down, so Shanna hadn't informed the emperor yet. In order to be prepared, countermeasures must be taken, and then already initiate him. Marie had no clues as to the book's sequel, but she remembered one thing for sure. The book had been in the mansion when Shanna had summoned her familiar Raphael. Even if it had been stolen, it was unlikely to be read, since it was written in an ancient language. It wasn't as simple as it seemed, so Shanna decided she had to tell Rune about everything sooner rather than later. Downstairs, she found her 2 men drinking hard liquor with passion. They were already quite drunk, though they claimed not to be. Shanna was not to be fooled. The emperor sparkled when he drank, and maybe others didn't notice it, but she couldn't hide it that easily. Then the men began to urge Shanna to join the party, but she refused. Marie, who had started drinking at some point, joined them. The battle Shanna didn't want to get into was sorely lost. Alcohol poured out in rivers, creating different combinations indiscriminately mixed together. Glasses were emptied one by one, and everyone in the room gradually sank into an intoxicating oblivion. The witch's body was very sensitive to the effects of alcohol, so she always had to control herself. And today was no exception, no matter how much she wanted to relax. They were so loud, shouting to Shanna about the proper way to drink alcohol, or offering to have a drink for a brooder shake. She recognized that she was to blame for their infatuation herself, for she had personally introduced them to the culture of different alcohol. It was worth it, for such happy moments had not happened for a long time. Shanna was already too drunk and not thinking straight, so it was decided to postpone the children's issues until tomorrow, when everyone was sober. Happy time should be enjoyed to the fullest. And the rest of the evening, the family had fun playing and drinking. After a couple hours, the two, the Duke and Marie, were finally drunk, and the servants took them to their chambers. Shanna's condition was better than theirs, and fortunately, Luther carried her in his arms to the room. She liked to be in her lover's arms, so she enjoyed the warmth, putting her cheek against her husband's chest. But it wasn't fair that Luther drank more than anyone else, but everyone but him was intoxicated. It was probably a peculiarity of the dragon's power. The possible solution was to have more children and pass these powers on to them. And for Luther, it was a great opportunity to realize his nightly pranks, because while he is sober, Shanna can take advantage of his helplessness and torture him. Shanna blushed, glaring at her lustful husband. She hadn't had thoughts like that before, but after Rune had mentioned it, she had. The couple went out onto the balcony. It turned out that Luther was not carrying her to her room at all, but to the fresh air. He had long remembered that his beloved wanted to look at the blossoming trees that adorned the garden, with their delicacy and ephemeral beauty. In the entire empire, Luther had no equal in understanding others, much less his own woman. This skill was necessary to meet the standards of the others. The lovers were enjoying the beautiful night sky and the colours illuminated by the moon. A light breeze blew their figures and hair, giving the evening a pleasant serenity. If every day were like this one, happiness would exist forever and unconditionally. But unfortunately, all good things come to an end. Sooner or later, Luther and Shanna would realise that Raphael was just messing with them, and then there would be resentment. Such vile thoughts were what Lalofu was suggesting to his younger brother, making him more and more doubtful. He continued his venomously sweet speeches about how his presence would one day become unbearable to them for lack of patience, and Luther's parting glance confirmed it as he contemptuously escorted the familiars off on their own. Lalofu handed Raphael the book that Shanna had lost, and told him that if his witch contacted her sister from the other world through the mirror, it would be too late. Lalofu's plans were at odds with his goals and needs, which alarmed Raphael. But the older brother was only willing to consider the wolf cub's wishes. The most important thing was to make it a reality. A consensus seemed to have been reached. Lalofu, reaching out to his brother, was willing to make a deal with him if it suited him, and offered to turn back time together. If it was possible to go back to the beginning, it was a wish that many people had, and few could refuse such an offer, for the chance to do so was rare, even for witches. The romantic evening ended quickly, and Shanna, who thought her husband was sleeping beside her, awoke to the morning rays. The night was over all too quickly, and the girl found herself alone in bed, calling out to her husband. Rune wasn't there. It seemed that the bed had not even been touched and had long since cooled down. There was no sign of the Emperor in her chambers. It was new to her that he woke up and didn't even say good morning to her. It had never happened before. Usually he woke up earlier to spend more time with his Empress, always waiting for her to wake up, starting to work right in bed. But this time, she didn't even notice him leaving. The girl was drawn away by the fresh morning breeze blowing red rose petals into her chambers through the open window that let in bright sunlight. A strong rose odour could be heard wafting from the air. It was unexpected because the manor hadn't had such a strong scent in a long time. The girl decided to check it, standing up on her legs, which were so woozy, as if she had been running all night long. She looked out the window in bewilderment and couldn't believe her eyes, wondering what had happened while she slept. The yard was full of red roses, covering all the flower beds with a bright canvas. But it was impossible. Suddenly, there was a rumble of falling cleaning utensils behind her. It was Marie, who flew into the room and threw herself at her mistress with a hug, as if on the first day of their acquaintance, rejoicing at her long-awaited awakening. Shanna had a strong sense of déjà vu. As she had expected, Marie said that she was going to make her a hot porridge with mushrooms and carrots that Miss hated, and ran out of the chambers with tears of joy in her eyes. Shanna tried to explain to herself that she missed home so much that she was now dreaming about this place. The girl scratched her head, trying to assess the situation. It didn't look like a dream, because the porridge Marianne had brought her tasted like the real thing. That aftertaste. It suddenly dawned on Shanna that it was similar to every detail of that first day in this world from her memories. The dialogue was identical. Marie introduced herself as Miss Castilla's personal maid and her right hand, raising her left limb and showing her muscles. Shanna lowered her eyes, staring into her cup of tea. She didn't want to admit the strangeness, but it seemed the girl had quite definitely gone back in time. As Marie recounted the information Shanna already knew about Count Castilla's ancient mansion, the mistress thought that perhaps it was still a realistic dream, but the true reason she had been transported to the past was impossible to know. And so the original behaviour would have to be adhered to anyway. She also told Marie that she had lost her memory with a calm expression. Wow, that time the event had scared her so much that Shanna didn't know what to do. But this time she was jubilantly aware of her maturation and experience. Marie mentioned His Majesty's warm embrace yesterday again, causing Shanna to choke up. Yes, he really had a talent for that. The girl almost said something, but she remembered how he had once saved her. Marie insisted that Shanna, as His Majesty's lover, should think it over carefully. Especially since the two of them had been together for 4 days, they must have been doing something out of the bounds of public propriety. Marie was both embarrassed and delighted. Shanna remembered to push Marie out, just like the other time. The maid said to ring the bell one last time if mistress needed anything, and left. It was extremely difficult to behave the same way as the first time. A lot of exciting events had happened that time, so the empress remembered everything quite clearly, but it was still laborious to answer word for word. So Shanna decided to write everything down. She was used to doing it by hand when she became empress, so she quickly wrote down her reasoning. Her handwriting was understood only by her, so there shouldn't be any problems. In her heart, she was glad for such sudden movements. This way she could deal with everything she'd done before. She had a chance to be careful this time, because one careless move could turn her whole world upside down. The girl was lost in speculation about what had happened. She couldn't, like the plot of some fantasy book, get a chance for rebirth when the heavens gave her permission to do so, like the unfortunate protagonist. But after all, Shanna was happy enough as it was. She looked longingly at her notes, not realizing what she had done wrong. The familiar gossip that the mistress was awake and complaining about everything, though she was no angel herself, was heard outside the window. Marie interrupted the whispers of the servants announcing the fines. Everything must look perfect. The maid paced down the hall, wondering why Miss Shanna wasn't mad at her today, for she definitely needed to add more seasoning to her porridge. Usually she got a hard slap for her misbehaviour and worrying too much about everything. The loss of her mistress's memory was terrible news, but just this one conversation, fittingly friendly, greatly encouraged Marie, and she promised herself to work even harder and torture the servants more for the sake of her dear Miss Shanna.